Hello and welcome. I know many of you use these videos to help you fall asleep. So before we begin, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also comment where you're from and at what time you're watching. Take a moment to get comfortable, relax, and let yourself unwind. The wind howled through the dense forest, shaking the brittle autumn leaves like rattling bones. Nathan Carter pulled his coat tighter around himself as he stepped onto the overgrown path leading deeper into the woods. He had read about the hanging tree before, a cursed landmark hidden miles away from the nearest town. Dozens of people had taken their lives here over the centuries, their bodies left swaying from its thick, gnarled branches. Locals refused to go near it, whispering that the tree called to those who strayed too close, urging them to join the others. Nathan wasn't the type to believe in ghost stories, but he wasn't about to turn down a chance at a breakthrough article. He was a journalist, after all, and stories like this sold. He glanced at his phone. No signal. Just as expected. He had driven for nearly 2 hours from the city, following a rough set of directions from an old man at a gas station. The man had given him a warning before he left. "You go looking for that tree, son. You best be careful," the old man had said, shaking his head. "It don't just stand there. It watches. And if you listen too close, it talks." Nathan had laughed it off, but now, standing in the thick silence of the woods, the words clung to him like a bad dream. A few more steps, and the forest seemed to tighten around him, the trees growing taller, their branches reaching across the sky like skeletal fingers. Then he saw it. The hanging tree stood in the clearing, alone and ancient. Its massive trunk was twisted and dark, its bark rough and split with deep cracks. The branches stretched outward unnaturally long and thick, perfect for holding a rope. Nathan's stomach tightened. There were no bodies, of course, but he could still see the marks. The limbs bore scars, deep grooves where rope had bitten into the wood. Beneath the tree, the ground was darker, almost black, as if the earth had been fed something unnatural. Nathan exhaled and pulled out his camera. He needed photos for his article. As he raised the lens, a gust of wind sent the branches swaying, their movement eerily slow, as if unseen hands were pulling on them. He snapped a few shots, adjusting the focus. Then he heard it, a whisper. At first, he thought it was just the wind, but as he lowered the camera, the sound became clearer. Soft voices overlapping, barely above a breath. Nathan turned sharply. Nothing. His heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. He stepped closer to the tree, placing a hand on its rough bark. The moment his fingers touched the surface, a chill ran through him, deep and sharp, like ice sliding down his spine. "Help us," a voice whispered. Nathan yanked his hand back. His breath came in quick gasps. He spun around again, scanning the forest. The trees stood silent, unmoving. "Get a grip," he muttered to himself. He was letting the stories get to him. Pulling out his notebook, he scribbled a few notes about the tree's eerie appearance. Then, deciding he needed more material, he set up his voice recorder and placed it on the ground near the roots. He pressed record and cleared his throat. "This is Nathan Carter, reporting from the hanging tree," he began. "The area is completely deserted. The tree is." A sudden snap echoed through the clearing. Nathan froze. It sounded like a branch breaking, but there was no wind strong enough to do that. He turned, his eyes scanning the tree. A fresh rope hung from one of the branches. His stomach dropped. That hadn't been there before. The rope swayed gently, as if something had just been cut down. Nathan took a slow step back. Then he heard it again, the whisper. But this time it wasn't one voice. It was many, a chorus of soft, urgent murmurs, pressing against his ears, slipping beneath his skin. "Join us," they whispered. "Come closer." Nathan's breath hitched. He grabbed his recorder, stuffed it in his pocket, and turned to leave. As he stepped away, something crunched beneath his shoe. Looking down, he saw a pile of bones, small and brittle, scattered among the roots. Human bones. Nathan stumbled back, nearly tripping over himself. His instincts screamed at him to run. But before he could move, the rope began to twist, turning towards him. And then, in a slow, deliberate motion, it reached down. Nathan's breath caught in his throat. The rope, thick, frayed, and impossibly old, was moving on its own, stretching downward like an arm reaching for him. His mind fought against what his eyes were seeing. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. His body screamed at him to run, but something held him frozen in place. The whispers grew louder, swirling around him, weaving through the air like threads of a terrible melody. "Come join us," they murmured. "It doesn't hurt. Not for long." Nathan wrenched himself backward, his boots scraping against the dirt. He stumbled away from the tree, his pulse hammering in his ears. The rope stopped moving. It hung still, as if it had never shifted at all. His breath came in ragged gasps. He had to get out of here. Now. He turned and hurried back toward the path, his hands shaking as he fumbled with his phone. No service. He tried to steady his thoughts. The car wasn't far, just a short hike back, and then he could leave this place behind. But as he walked, something felt wrong. The trees seemed closer together now, their twisted trunks forming a barrier around him. The path, once clear, was narrowing, swallowed by roots and shadows. His heart pounded. Had he taken the wrong direction? That wasn't possible. He had followed the same trail in. He spun around, searching for familiar markers, but the forest no longer looked the same. Then he saw them, figures standing among the trees. They were barely visible, just faint shapes in the mist. Motionless, watching. Nathan's blood turned ice cold. "Hello," he called, his voice breaking. No response. He took a step back. The figures didn't move, but as he blinked, they seemed closer. His breath came in short, shallow bursts. His fingers clenched into fists, nails digging into his palms. He had to keep moving. He turned sharply and walked faster. His boots crunched against the dead leaves, the only sound in the suffocating silence. He didn't dare look back. The car. Just get to the car. The path twisted again, curving deeper into the woods. He quickened his pace, heart pounding against his ribs. The whispers had stopped, but the feeling hadn't. He was being followed. Then footsteps, soft at first, then louder. Nathan broke into a run. The trees blurred past him. His breaths came in ragged gasps. He didn't know where he was going. He just needed to get away. The forest was changing, shifting, trapping him in its grasp. Then light, a flicker between the trees. His car. A wave of relief crashed over him as he burst into the clearing. His car sat exactly where he had left it, parked on the narrow dirt road. He fumbled for his keys, his fingers trembling. He yanked the door open, threw himself inside, and slammed it shut. His hands shook as he jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life. He didn't waste a second. The tires kicked up dirt as he sped forward, tearing down the road, leaving the forest behind. His hands were slick with sweat. His breath hitched in his throat. The whispers still echoed in his head, crawling under his skin. The hanging tree. The rope. The figures in the woods. He glanced at the rearview mirror. The road stretched behind him, empty. But just for a second, just for the briefest, most terrible moment, he swore he saw someone sitting in the back seat. A shadow. A face. Watching. The car swerved as he gasped, twisting the wheel. When he looked again, nothing. The seat was empty. Nathan forced himself to breathe. He was just seeing things, just shaken up. But deep down, he knew better. He wasn't alone, and he never would be again. Nathan's grip tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. His breath came fast, shallow, his mind screaming at him to keep driving, to get as far away from that cursed place as possible. But no matter how hard he tried, the feeling wouldn't leave him. He wasn't alone. The road ahead twisted through the thick trees, stretching endlessly into the night. His headlights carved a narrow path through the darkness, but something felt wrong. The air in the car was heavy, suffocating, as if something unseen pressed against his chest. Then cold. A deep, unnatural chill spread through the car, creeping up his arms, sinking into his bones. It was the same cold he had felt beneath that tree. Nathan swallowed hard, refusing to look in the rearview mirror again. He couldn't. Just drive. Just get home. The road stretched on, longer than it should have. He had driven this way before, twice in fact, but now it felt endless. The trees loomed taller, their branches reaching over the road like grasping fingers. Minutes passed, then more. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat, the screen lighting up. A notification. Nathan hesitated before glancing at it. No service, but somehow. One new voicemail. His stomach twisted. His phone had been out of service since he arrived at the hanging tree. How could he have a voicemail? His fingers trembled as he tapped the screen. The message began to play. At first, nothing. Just static. A long, crackling hiss. Then, a whisper. Low, distant, almost swallowed by the static. Nathan. His name. His pulse slammed against his ribs. The voice was thin, fragile, but it was there. And then more. Soft, layered whispers, overlapping, rising, growing louder. The same voices he had heard under the tree. Come back. Nathan's hands jerked on the wheel. The car swerved, tires scraping against the road's edge. He gasped, gripping the wheel tighter, forcing himself back into the center of the road. His heart pounded so hard it hurt. The voices on the voicemail grew more frantic, desperate. Come back. Come back. It's waiting for you. You belong here. Then silence. Nathan stared at the phone, his breath caught in his throat. His thumb hovered over the delete button, but something stopped him. A faint sound at the very end of the recording. Not a whisper. Not static. A creaking rope. Nathan threw the phone into the passenger seat and pressed harder on the gas. The engine growled as the car sped forward, but no matter how fast he went, the road stretched on and on. The feeling in his chest grew heavier. And then, the headlights flickered. Once, twice, and then darkness. The car's engine stuttered. The dashboard lights blinked out. The radio cut to silence. The entire vehicle went dead, rolling to a stop in the middle of the road. Nathan's breath came in short, sharp gasps. He turned the key in the ignition. Nothing. His fingers trembled as he tried again. Still nothing. The silence in the car was unbearable. And then he heard it. A rustling outside. Footsteps. Soft. Slow. Dragging. Coming closer. Nathan's pulse roared in his ears. His hands gripped the wheel so tightly they ached. A shadow moved just beyond the windshield. A shape in the darkness. He couldn't see its face. But he didn't need to. He knew what it was. His breath hitched as something tapped against the glass. Once. Twice. Then, a whisper right outside the car. Open the door. Nathan squeezed his eyes shut. His entire body was frozen, his fingers locked around the steering wheel. He didn't dare move. He didn't dare breathe. Outside, the night was impossibly silent. No wind. No insects. Just the thing standing beyond the windshield, waiting. Another tap on the glass. Lighter this time. Almost gentle. Then, the whisper came again, right against the driver's side window. Open the door, Nathan. His name. His entire body seized at the sound of it. Slowly, his eyes flickered open, drawn against his will to the window beside him. A face. Pale. Hollow. The eyes sunk in pits of darkness. The mouth stretched too wide, lips cracked and peeling. It was inches from his own. Nathan sucked in a sharp breath. His hand shot out, slamming the lock button. The face didn't move. It just watched him. And then, ever so slowly, it lifted a hand. Thin. Gray. Fingers ending in long, cracked nails. The hand pressed against the glass, leaving a damp, smudged imprint. Nathan couldn't move. He couldn't scream. He just watched as the mouth twisted into something that almost resembled a smile. Then, the glass began to creak. Hairline fractures crawled from the point where the thing's palm rested. Nathan's breath came in ragged gasps. His fingers scrambled for the keys, twisting them desperately in the ignition. Please, please start. The engine gave a weak whine. The fractures spread. A low, distorted voice hummed from the other side of the glass. You can't run. Nathan twisted the key again, harder this time. The engine sputtered, then roared to life. The thing's head jerked suddenly, its mouth snapping open. A guttural, rasping scream tore from its throat, an unnatural sound that made Nathan's skull vibrate. The glass shattered. Nathan didn't wait. His foot slammed down on the gas. The tires screeched as the car lurched forward. The thing's face vanished into the darkness, swallowed by the night as the car tore down the road. Nathan didn't look back. He couldn't. His hands trembled on the wheel, his breath ragged and uneven. His mind screamed at him to keep going, to get as far away from that tree as possible. But the road, it wouldn't end. No matter how fast he drove, how many turns he took, the trees remained the same twisted branches, the same darkness pressing in from all sides. His headlights caught something ahead, a clearing. Nathan's heart leapt. He pushed the car faster, his eyes locked on the open space. But then his stomach dropped. The branches parted, revealing what lay beyond. A tree, the hanging tree. Nathan's vision blurred. His hands shook violently. No, he had left it behind. He had driven away. So why was it here? His breath came in fast, panic bursts as he slammed on the brakes. The car skidded to a stop, just feet from the gnarled roots. And then, a sound. Above him, the soft, rhythmic creak of a rope swaying in the wind. Nathan's eyes drifted upward. A shape hung from the highest branch. Limp, motionless. The body swayed gently. Nathan's blood turned to ice as his headlights illuminated the figure. The face. It was his own. Nathan's stomach lurched. His mind shattered. He stumbled backward in his seat, gasping, clawing at the door handle. But before he could move, a whisper, from all around him, from the trees, from the darkness, from inside his own mind. Join us. Nathan's pulse pounded in his ears, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The figure hanging from the tree, his own lifeless body, swayed gently, its head tilted downward as if watching him. The noose creaked softly with each movement, a sickening lullaby that sent ice through his veins. He tore his gaze away, fumbling for the gear shift. His hands trembled so violently he could barely grip it. He needed to move. He needed to get out of here. But then, the whispers came again. Join us. This time, they didn't come from outside the car. They came from inside. Nathan's breath caught in his throat. Slowly, he turned his head. The back seat was no longer empty. Shapes sat in the shadows, their outlines barely visible in the dim glow of the dashboard lights. Dozens of them, packed together, pressed against the seats and each other. Some looked freshly dead, their skin pale and eyes dull. Others were nothing but husks, flesh rotted away to expose yellowed bone and dark, empty sockets. They stared at him, mouths hung open, whispering in unison. Join us. Nathan choked on a scream. His hands jerked the wheel as he slammed his foot onto the gas pedal. The tires spun against the dirt before catching traction, launching the car forward. The force sent his head snapping back, but he didn't care. He had to go. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the wheel. Trees blurred past in the headlights, their twisted branches clawing at the night sky like skeletal fingers. The road twisted and turned, but no matter how fast he drove, the whispers clung to him. You can't leave. The words slithered beneath his skin, wrapped around his ribs like a vice. The car jerked violently. Something was in the road. Nathan barely had time to react before the front bumper collided with it, sending whatever it was tumbling over the hood. A sickening thud echoed through the car. His foot slammed the brakes. The tires screeched. The car skidded to a halt. Silence. Nathan's chest rose and fell in rapid bursts. His hands were locked on the wheel, his entire body rigid with shock. He swallowed hard. Slowly, his eyes flickered to the rearview mirror. A shape lay motionless in the road behind him. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a person. It was something else. Nathan's breath hitched. Every instinct screamed at him to drive, to forget whatever was back there and keep going. But something about it, something about the way it lay so still, made his stomach churn. He didn't want to look. He had to. With a shaking hand, he reached for the door handle and pushed it open. Cold air rushed in, sending a shiver down his spine. The ground felt unsteady beneath his feet as he stepped out, his legs threatening to buckle. The figure lay sprawled in the dirt, limbs bent at unnatural angles. Nathan took a hesitant step closer, and then it moved. A single sharp twitch. Nathan staggered back, his breath caught in his throat. The figure twitched again, its head snapping upward. Nathan's stomach dropped. It was him. The same face. The same clothes. A second Nathan lay in the road, his eyes wide, his mouth curling into an unnatural grin. Nathan stumbled backward, his pulse hammering. The other him, his copy, began to move, its limbs cracking as it pushed itself upright. Nathan didn't wait. He spun on his heel and bolted for the car. But the second he reached the door, a hand clamped around his wrist. Freezing cold. Unnaturally strong. Nathan cried out, twisting, kicking, thrashing against the grip. But the fingers only tightened. And then, the whispers filled his head. Join us. His vision blurred. His ears rang. The world tilted, spun, collapsed in on itself. And in that final moment, just before everything turned to darkness, Nathan saw the tree again. The rope hanging from its highest branch. Swinging gently. Waiting for him. Nathan's head throbbed, a dull, pulsing ache radiating from the base of his skull. His body felt heavy, as though he were sinking into the earth itself. Something rough pressed against his cheek. Dirt. Slowly, his eyes fluttered open. Darkness surrounded him. The cold, damp air clung to his skin, thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. Where was he? He tried to move, but his limbs barely responded. It was like his body no longer belonged to him. A whisper brushed against his ear. You're almost home. Nathan's breath hitched. His fingers twitched, digging into the soil beneath him. He forced himself upright, ignoring the dizziness that threatened to pull him back down. The moon peeked through the trees, casting long, eerie shadows across the ground. And there looming before him was the tree, the hanging tree. Its gnarled branches stretched outward like twisted arms, adorned with dozens of nooses that swayed gently despite the still air. Nathan swallowed hard. A movement above drew his gaze upward. Figures dangled from the branches. Not corpses. They were watching him, their hollow eyes locked onto his, their heads tilting in unison. His breath came in ragged bursts as he staggered backward. A familiar voice rang out from the shadows. You shouldn't have come here. Nathan whirled around. A man stood at the base of the tree, half shrouded in darkness. He was tall, his frame draped in an old, tattered coat. His face was weathered, lined with deep creases, his eyes dark pools of exhaustion. Nathan's heart pounded. Who are you? He stammered. The man let out a slow breath. Someone who tried to leave. Nathan's stomach twisted. Tried? The man's expression darkened. No one leaves. The words sent a chill down Nathan's spine. He took a step back, but the man reached out, gripping his arm. His touch was ice cold. You feel it, don't you? The man whispered. The pull. Nathan's lips parted, but he couldn't find the words. Because he did feel it. A strange, invisible force tugging at his chest. An overwhelming, insidious desire to step forward, to wrap his fingers around the rough rope and slip the noose over his head. The whispers deepened, turning into something almost melodic. Nathan squeezed his eyes shut. "No," he choked out. He yanked his arm free and stumbled away, his mind screaming at him to run. But the man didn't follow. He simply watched, his face unreadable. "You can run," he murmured, "but you can't escape." Nathan didn't look back. His legs carried him through the trees, branches whipping at his arms, the whispers growing fainter with each step. Then, a shape appeared in the distance. His car. Nathan's chest swelled with relief. He sprinted forward, his fingers fumbling for the door handle. He wrenched it open and threw himself inside, slamming the door shut behind him. His hands shook as he turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life. Nathan's breath came in quick, shallow gasps as he gripped the wheel. He hit the gas. The tires spun against the dirt, kicking up a cloud of dust as the car lurched forward. Faster, faster. The trees blurred past in streaks of shadow and moonlight. The road stretched ahead, winding through the forest like a serpent. But something was wrong. The road wasn't ending. No matter how far he drove, the forest remained the same. The same trees, the same twisting path. Nathan's hands tightened on the wheel. His heart pounded against his ribs. This wasn't right. The road should have led him back to the main highway. But it didn't. It only circled back toward the tree. Nathan's stomach lurched. He slammed the brakes. The car skidded to a halt, gravel crunching beneath the tires. His breath came in uneven gasps as he looked up. There it was, the hanging tree, standing exactly where it had been before, waiting for him. The whispers returned, thick and suffocating, curling around his mind like vines. "You can't leave." Nathan's vision swam. His grip on reality felt as fragile as glass. Then, movement in the rearview mirror caught his eye. A figure sat in the back seat. The man from before. His expression was blank. Nathan barely had time to react before a pair of hands reached from the darkness, clutching his throat, tightening, pulling him under. Nathan's vision blurred as cold fingers tightened around his throat. He gasped, clawing at the unseen hands constricting his airway, but there was nothing solid to grab, just an icy pressure, a crushing force dragging him deeper into the suffocating dark. His body jerked against the seat, his legs kicking wildly. The interior of the car wavered, the edges of his sight turning black. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the grip loosened. Nathan collapsed forward, coughing, sucking in ragged breaths. His chest burned. He threw himself toward the door, fumbling for the handle with shaking hands. It wouldn't budge. The lock refused to lift, the mechanism jammed. A faint whisper brushed against his ear. "You're not ready yet." Nathan's skin prickled. His trembling fingers reached for the keys still lodged in the ignition. The moment he touched them, the dashboard lights flickered wildly. The radio crackled to life, spewing static, then voices, low, droning, overlapping whispers. Then a single voice rose above the rest. His own. Nathan Carter, reporting live at the hanging tree. The site of countless tragedies, where history warns us to stay away. His stomach dropped. It was his voice from earlier, the recording he had taken when he first arrived. But then something changed. The voice continued, but not with words he had ever spoken. Where history warns us to stay away, but we never listen. We always come back, again and again, until we stay. Nathan's blood turned to ice. His shaking fingers twisted the key, killing the engine. Silence. The radio died. The whispers, however, remained. Low, persistent, just beneath his skin. His breaths came in shallow gasps as he stared ahead. The hanging tree stood in front of him, unchanged. The figures in the branches watched, waiting. A deep, gnawing fear crept into his gut. He had to get out, now. Nathan braced himself, then rammed his shoulder against the door. It groaned, but didn't give. Again, the metal bent slightly under the pressure. Again, a sharp crack. And then, the door flew open. Nathan tumbled onto the cold dirt, landing hard on his hands and knees. His breath came in desperate gulps. No time to think. No time to hesitate. He scrambled to his feet and ran. The forest swallowed him whole, branches clawing at his skin, the ground uneven beneath his feet. But he didn't stop. He didn't dare. The whispers chased him, curling through the trees like smoke. Come back. You belong here. Nathan clenched his jaw and forced his legs to move faster. But no matter how far he ran, the path didn't change. The trees, the dirt, the air, it all remained the same, endless. Then, up ahead, a break in the darkness. A house. Nathan's heart slammed against his ribs. He didn't recognize it. It hadn't been here before. Yet, something about it felt familiar. The windows were dark, the wooden siding weathered and rotting. A single lantern flickered on the porch. Nathan hesitated for only a moment before bolting toward it. Anything was better than the trees. His feet pounded up the steps. He reached for the door, and it opened before he could touch it. Inside, darkness loomed, but deep within, a faint glow pulsed. Nathan swallowed hard. He turned, glancing over his shoulder. The forest stood behind him, silent, waiting. The hanging tree was nowhere in sight, but he knew better. It was still there, watching. Nathan took a breath, steeling himself. Then, with slow, cautious steps, he crossed the threshold. The door creaked shut behind him, and the whispers stopped. For the first time since he had arrived, a shiver crawled up his spine. This was not a victory. Something was waiting for him inside, and it had just closed the door. Nathan stood frozen in the entryway, his breath shallow. The silence inside the house was thick, suffocating. The only light came from the faint glow deeper within, pulsing like a dying heartbeat. The air smelled of damp wood and something else, something faintly metallic. Blood? He took a hesitant step forward. The floor creaked beneath his weight. Somewhere in the darkness, a soft sound stirred. A shuffle, a breath. Nathan's hands clenched into fists. His instincts screamed at him to turn back, to run. But where? The forest wasn't safe. The car was useless. And the tree? He wouldn't go back to the tree. Gritting his teeth, he forced himself forward. The glow led him down a narrow hallway, the wallpaper peeling in long, curling strips. The walls seemed damp. No, not damp. Wet. Nathan's stomach twisted as his fingers brushed against the surface. The texture was soft, pliant. Not wood. Not plaster. Something else. Something alive. His breath hitched. He yanked his hand back, resisting the urge to wipe it against his jeans. He kept moving. At the end of the hall, a door stood slightly ajar. The light seeped through the crack. Nathan hesitated, his pulse hammering in his ears. Then, gathering what little courage he had left, he pushed it open. The room beyond was small, suffocating. Dust swirled in the dim glow of an oil lamp resting on an old wooden desk. Scattered across the desk were sheets of paper, yellowed with age. Nathan stepped closer, his fingers ghosting over the edges. Handwritten notes. Messy, desperate scribbles. He picked one up, his eyes scanning the words. It doesn't let you leave. His throat tightened. He picked up another. The tree is alive. It calls to us. It wants more. A chill ran through him. The third note was stained, darkened with something dried and flaking. If you hear the whispers, it's already too late. Nathan's fingers trembled. He set the paper down, his breathing uneven. The air shifted. A creak behind him. His body went rigid. Slowly he turned. The doorway was empty. The hall beyond, nothing but blackness. But something was there, watching, waiting. Nathan backed away, his heel knocking against something solid. A chair. He nearly jumped out of his skin. Get out. His mind screamed it, but his feet wouldn't move. The whispers had stopped, but something else had taken their place. A feeling, a presence, a weight in the air, pressing against his skin, squeezing his lungs. He wasn't alone. Nathan's gaze flickered back to the desk. His fingers twitched. One last note lay separate from the others. Unlike the rest, the ink was fresh. The words scrawled in a trembling, uneven hand. "Turn around." His breath caught in his throat. A shadow shifted in the corner of the room. No sound, no movement. Just there. Nathan's skin prickled with cold. He didn't want to turn around, but his body moved anyway. Slow, stiff, as if something else were guiding him. And then he saw it. A figure stood in the doorway. Tall, motionless, featureless. Its form was barely more than a smudge in the dark, a void where light refused to touch. Nathan couldn't breathe. The figure didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe. But he knew without a doubt it was looking at him. The lantern flickered, and in that brief moment of light, he saw its face. A face he knew, a face he had seen before, a face he had stared at in the mirror every single day. His own. The light went out. Darkness swallowed the room, and the last thing Nathan heard was his own voice whispering, "It's time to join the others." Nathan gasped, stumbling backward, his legs colliding with the chair. The wooden frame scraped against the floor with a terrible shriek. He reached for the desk, his fingers shaking, his breath ragged. The darkness pressed in around him, thick and suffocating. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, deafening. And then, a soft whisper, right against his ear. "You can't fight it." Nathan spun, his back slamming against the wall. His chest rose and fell in frantic, uneven breaths. The room was empty. No figure, no shadow, nothing. Just the silence, stretching unbearably long. His hands curled into fists. He had to get out. Nathan bolted for the doorway, his feet barely touching the ground as he tore down the hallway. The walls pulsed, the dampness seeping through his shirt, clinging to his skin. The whispers were back, soft, persistent, calling his name. "Nathan, Nathan, it's time." His stomach lurched. His fingers fumbled along the walls, searching for something, anything. Then, the entryway came into view. The front door was open. His lungs burned as he sprinted toward it. The cold night air curled into the house, sharp and cruel against his damp skin. He reached the threshold, his foot crossing onto the porch, and the world tilted. Nathan gasped as his vision blurred, his knees buckling beneath him. A wave of nausea crashed into his stomach. The ground felt wrong, soft, like rotting wood, like earth, like... His fingers dug into the floorboards, but they weren't floorboards anymore. They were roots, thick, pulsing, moving beneath his touch. His breath hitched. The house was gone. The walls had melted into the night, swallowed by the endless void of the forest. And ahead of him, the hanging tree. It loomed impossibly large, its branches twisting like skeletal fingers against the sky. The rope swayed, empty yet waiting. Nathan tried to move, but his body refused. His feet were sinking. The roots coiled around his ankles, slithering up his calves like hungry snakes. He clawed at them, panic rising in his throat. The more he struggled, the tighter they became. "Let go," the whispers urged. "Join us." Nathan thrashed, his voice raw, his vision tunneling. The rope hung lower now, as if reaching for him. The whispers grew louder. They weren't just around him anymore. They were inside him. His own voice echoed back at him, warped and wrong. "It's easier this way." Nathan's fingers dug into the earth, his nails scraping against something hard. Wood. No, not just wood. A box. A small, half-buried wooden box. His mind screamed at him to run, but something in his gut told him. This was important. With one last desperate lunge, he tore his foot free and grabbed the box, yanking it from the dirt. The moment his fingers closed around it, the whispers stopped. The roots recoiled, slithering away like retreating snakes. The ground beneath him solidified. The air shifted. Nathan gasped, stumbling back, clutching the box to his chest. The tree still loomed over him, but something had changed. The weight in the air, the pull, the hunger. It was watching him, waiting. Nathan's hands trembled as he pried the lid open. Inside, a bundle of papers, faded, brittle, stained with age, and beneath them, a rusted key. Nathan's breath hitched. He didn't know why, but he knew. This key meant something, something important, and whatever it unlocked, it was his only way out. Nathan's fingers tightened around the rusted key. His breath came in shallow gasps as he glanced back at the hanging tree. The branches twisted in the wind, the rope swaying like a pendulum counting down. The silence was thick, unnatural. For the first time since stepping onto this cursed land, the whispers were gone. But he knew better than to believe he was safe. Nathan turned the key over in his palm. It was heavy, cold, ancient. A strange symbol was etched into the metal, something that looked like an eye, surrounded by jagged lines. His gut twisted. He didn't know why, but he had to find what this key opened. The moment the thought crossed his mind, the forest shifted. The trees around him groaned, their shadows stretching unnaturally long. The roots beneath his feet pulsed, as though they had a heartbeat of their own. Then, a path appeared, narrow, winding, leading into the darkness. Nathan swallowed hard. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but there was nowhere to go. The house was gone. The town was too far. This was the only way forward. His legs felt like lead as he took the first step. Then another. The path coiled between the trees, the air growing colder with each step. His breath fogged in front of him. Somewhere in the distance, a low sound rumbled, like something breathing. The trees pressed in, their gnarled branches forming twisted shapes against the sky. The further he walked, the more the ground beneath him changed. From dirt to stone, from stone to something smooth and unnatural. His foot hit something solid. A step. Nathan's heart pounded. He lifted his gaze. A structure loomed before him. Half buried in the earth, covered in thick, tangled roots, stood a door. Massive, old, and locked. Nathan's fingers tightened around the key. His pulse thundered in his ears. This was it. His hands shook as he stepped closer. The symbol on the key glowed faintly in the darkness. The whispers had not returned, but he could feel them waiting, watching. Nathan swallowed hard, raised the key, and slid it into the rusted lock. For a moment, nothing. Then, a deep, echoing click. The ground trembled beneath him. Nathan took a step back as the door groaned, the roots slithering away like retreating fingers. The air shifted, thick with something heavy and wrong. The door creaked open. Beyond it, darkness. But not just any darkness. A void. A space that felt hungry. Nathan's breath hitched. Then from within, a voice. Soft. Familiar. Calling his name. Nathan's entire body went rigid. His blood turned ice cold. Because he knew that voice. Knew it better than his own. It was his father's. The man who had hanged himself beneath the tree 20 years ago. His breath caught in his throat. His legs refused to move. Nathan, the voice whispered from the darkness. Come inside. Nathan's grip tightened around the key. His mind screamed at him to run, but his feet stayed rooted to the ground. His father was dead. Dead. But if that was true, then who was calling him now? The voice came again, softer, laced with something strange. Desperation. Nathan, please. I need you. His pulse hammered against his ribs. A trick. It had to be. But what if? No. Nathan clenched his jaw. He had come too far. He had to see this through. Slowly, he stepped forward, one foot over the threshold, then another. The darkness swallowed him whole, and the door slammed shut behind him. The air inside the chamber was thick, suffocating, and colder than the deepest winter. Nathan's breath caught as the door behind him slammed shut with a force that shook the very walls. A cold draft whispered through the cracks in the stone, and the darkness wrapped itself around him like a suffocating blanket. His pulse raced. He could still hear the voice. Nathan. It came from the darkness, so familiar, yet wrong. He strained his eyes, but the void before him seemed to absorb the light, deepening with every passing second. His heart thudded in his chest, every beat echoing in his ears like the sound of a drum. "Please, son, come closer." The voice was soft, coaxing, laced with an emotion Nathan couldn't place. A chill crawled down his spine. He didn't want to move, but the compulsion was there again, pulling him toward the darkness, a magnetic force he couldn't explain. Something was waiting. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the key, his fingers still trembling. The ancient symbol seemed to pulse in the dim light, its power tugging at the edges of his consciousness. The whispers, no, not whispers anymore, but voices, began to grow louder. "Join us, Nathan." His father's voice. His own. Others. He clenched his fists, trying to fight the rising tide of terror that threatened to drown him. But the darkness, it felt alive. It beckoned him. He could hear his own heart echoing in the chamber, louder now, in sync with the rhythm of the voices. Every step forward was like wading through thick, heavy air. And then, just as his foot touched the cold floor of whatever place this was, the darkness gave way. A single, faint light glowed ahead, revealing a figure. A shadow, darker than the surrounding void, yet familiar in its shape. Nathan's breath caught in his throat. It was him, his father, the man he had buried all those years ago, the man whose body had been found beneath the hanging tree, lifeless, with a rope around his neck. He stood there motionless, his figure bathed in that faint, otherworldly light. His face was twisted, stretched into a grotesque version of the man Nathan had known. His eyes were empty, hollow sockets, and his lips pulled back in an unnatural smile. "Welcome, son," his father's voice rasped. "You've come to join me." The words twisted inside Nathan's head. His father's voice was the same, but it was no longer him. It was something else, something pretending to be him. Nathan felt his knees buckle, his body trembling uncontrollably as the truth finally sank in. This was the curse. The tree, the house, the whispers, it had all been leading him here. This place wasn't real. None of this was real. His father had been consumed by whatever dark force lurked in the roots of the hanging tree, and now the same fate awaited him. The tree didn't just take life, it fed on it. It twisted and warped everything that came near, pulling souls into its grasp to do its bidding. Nathan looked around him, his heart pounding in his chest. The walls of the chamber were lined with other figures, all of them suspended in midair, hanging as if they were trapped in the same endless nightmare. Their eyes were wide open, their mouths frozen in silent screams. And now, he was next. The air shifted. The voices grew louder. "Join us, Nathan, come home." The ground beneath his feet trembled. The roots, they were coming. They were crawling toward him, stretching from the walls, the floor, the very air itself. He had to run, had to break free. But the air was thick, suffocating him, drowning him in the darkness. His body refused to move, his legs like lead. "You can't escape," the voice of his father whispered, the tone now twisted and mocking. "You're part of it now." Nathan's eyes burned with tears. He couldn't breathe. He could feel the weight of the roots wrapping around his ankles, pulling him toward the ground. His hands grasped for anything, but there was nothing. The chamber was closing in on him. And then, he heard it. A sound. A voice. His own. "I won't." It came from within him. From deep inside, a strength he hadn't known he had. His body screamed in protest, but Nathan refused to let go. He wasn't going to join them. Not yet. Not ever. The key in his hand. With trembling fingers, Nathan twisted it, plunging it into the air before him as if it were a weapon. The moment it made contact, the ground shattered. A deafening crack split the silence, and everything around him, everything he had feared, fractured. The darkness splintered. The roots recoiled. The voices screamed. No! A final scream echoed in his mind, and then, silence. Nathan stood in the eerie silence, his breath ragged in his chest. The key burned in his palm, its metal hot against his skin. The dark force, the thing that had haunted him, the whispers, the false comfort of his father's voice, was gone. For a moment, he couldn't believe it. He stared at the fractured space around him. The chamber was no longer there. The roots were gone. The twisted shapes of the hanging figures dissolved into the air like smoke, fading into nothingness. Nathan didn't move. His mind was still reeling from everything he had seen, everything he had heard. He had been this close to joining them, to becoming a part of that darkness, trapped in the roots of the tree forever. He had almost given in, but something inside him had fought back. His legs trembled as he took his first tentative step forward, still clutching the key. The ground beneath his feet felt solid once again. The cold air had dissipated, replaced by a faint warmth, as though the very nature of this place had changed. The door behind him was still there, but it was no longer the door to the void. It was a simple wooden door, old but real. He reached for the handle. His fingers shook, but they gripped the door firmly, and as he turned it, the space around him began to shift. The darkness receded, replaced by soft moonlight filtering through a forest clearing. The ground beneath his feet was familiar, earth, grass, the solid feeling of reality returning to him. He stepped out into the night. The air was fresh, crisp. The hanging tree was still there, looming in the distance, but now it seemed different. Smaller, less menacing. It no longer held the same weight of despair, of loss. Nathan took a deep breath. The whispers were gone, but there was something else, a silence that was peaceful, quiet, and final. For the first time in what felt like forever, he could hear his own heartbeat. He turned and looked back toward the door. It was gone, just a space in the air where it had once stood. Nathan staggered forward, his legs barely able to hold him upright. He could still feel the lingering touch of the tree's curse in his bones, but the air felt different now. He was free, but at what cost? The tree had claimed so many lives, people who had come before him, their names lost to time, their bodies forgotten. The hanging tree had fed on them, pulled them into its roots, their souls trapped forever in the dark. And now Nathan knew. He had escaped, but only because he had survived. He wasn't sure what it meant, what would happen next, but he knew he couldn't stay here any longer. He turned away from the tree and walked into the forest. The world around him felt almost normal again. His heart still beat in his chest, his breath steady, the weight of his fear fading. As he walked, he noticed something strange. In the distance, the outline of a small town, his town, came into view. The same town he had grown up in, the one he had left so many years ago. He remembered that place, the roads he had walked, the houses he had lived in, but now they seemed distant, forgotten. Nathan blinked, trying to clear his head. He had been so consumed by the curse, by the whispers, by the compulsion to find the truth. Now, all he wanted was to get away from it. He didn't want to go back to that place. He couldn't. The town was gone. The road that had once led him back to it now seemed impossible. Just another memory, another path lost to time. And as Nathan walked further into the night, away from the hanging tree, he knew one thing for sure. He would never stop running. Never stop looking over his shoulder. Because the tree was still out there. And somewhere, in the shadows, the whispers would always be waiting. For the next soul to come too close. Name of the next story, The Silent Neighbor. The day the new neighbor moved in was the same as any other, at least on the surface. The sun was setting slowly over the quiet suburban neighborhood. The kind of neighborhood where everyone knew each other's names, where lawns were neatly trimmed, and children played in the streets until the streetlights flickered on. The house next door had been empty for months, its windows boarded up after the last occupants had suddenly moved away. No one ever knew why they left, but the gossip around town hinted at something strange. Maybe they couldn't afford it, maybe they had personal reasons, no one was sure. But that was all in the past, and today a new family had moved in. Or so it seemed. At first, I didn't think much of it. The moving truck was parked out front. The neighbors from down the street were helping, and there was the sound of furniture scraping across hardwood floors. A normal day, just like any other. I watched for a moment from my living room window, but after a while, I turned back to the book in my hands, too absorbed in the plot to give it much attention. Over the next few days, I didn't see much of the new neighbor. I'd pass by their house on my way to work, or come home to find their car parked in the driveway. But the curtains were always drawn, and the lights were dim. I thought that was odd. After all, everyone in the neighborhood was friendly, always eager to greet newcomers. But this new neighbor, kept to themselves. I figured they were just a private person, maybe shy or going through something. Then the sound started. At first, it was just a faint tapping, like something hard hitting the floor repeatedly. I couldn't tell what it was, but it was unmistakable. It came from next door, but it was subtle enough that I brushed it off, assuming it was just the sound of someone moving furniture. After all, it had only been a few days since they'd moved in. But then, a few nights later, the tapping turned into something more. It wasn't just the tapping. It was scraping like claws running across the wood, followed by a soft thump, then silence. The air grew thick with a kind of tension, the kind you feel when something's not right, but can't quite place why. I tried to ignore it, thinking maybe I was hearing things or that my mind was just playing tricks on me after a long, stressful day. But the next night it happened again, and the next. It was like a pattern, each night bringing something more disturbing, more unnatural. Sometimes I'd hear the scrape of something heavy being dragged across the floor, then the soft whoosh of something large brushing against the walls. I could almost feel the vibrations in my own walls. Each noise sent a chill creeping down my spine, but still, I told myself it was nothing. Just a neighbor settling in. The following weekend, I was out in my garden when I saw him, the neighbor. He stood at the edge of his front lawn, just standing there, staring at his house. His back was to me, and he was tall, thin, and wearing a plain gray shirt and jeans. He didn't move, didn't look around, just stared at the house as if lost in thought. I thought it was strange, but maybe he was just one of those people who liked to think outside, away from the noise of the house. I waved to him, but he didn't acknowledge me. I called out, but there was no response. He didn't even flinch. He just kept staring at the house. I felt a chill run through me. I didn't know why, but something about it felt wrong. Later that evening, the noises were worse than ever. There was a loud crash, followed by what sounded like glass shattering. I jumped from my seat, heart racing. I had to know what was happening. I grabbed my coat and went next door. At first, I thought about knocking, but then I hesitated. The silence that followed the crash felt almost too heavy. Something in my gut told me not to. Something told me to turn around and leave, but curiosity, and maybe a bit of worry, pushed me to try the doorbell. I pressed the button and waited. The chimes sounded faintly from inside, but there was no response. I rang it again. Still no answer. I tried knocking this time, harder. Finally, I heard footsteps from inside, slow and measured. The door creaked open just a few inches, and a pair of eyes appeared in the crack. His face was pale, his eyes almost too wide, unnaturally so. His skin was so smooth that it looked almost artificial, and his lips were drawn tight into a straight line. He stared at me with a vacant expression, and for a second, I thought I saw something wrong, something alien in the way he looked at me. His gaze was unsettling, like I wasn't even a person to him. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice flat, emotionless. I smiled nervously. I heard a crash from inside. "Is everything okay?" His eyes flicked behind him. to the dimly lit house, and then back to me. He didn't answer for a long time, and for a moment, I thought he might close the door on me. Finally, he spoke. "Everything's fine. Just moving things around." His voice didn't match his expression. It was too calm, too controlled. I nodded, though I didn't believe him. "Well, if you need any help, just let me know. I'm just next door." He didn't respond. His eyes just lingered on me for a second longer than necessary, and then the door slowly shut. The click of the lock echoed in my ears, and I stood there, feeling strangely cold. I tried to shake it off, telling myself that I was just overthinking it, but as I walked back to my house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right with him. The next few days passed in a blur of unease. The sounds continued at night, getting more disturbing each time. The scraping, the thumping, the eerie silence followed by that strange, low moaning. Something was in that house, something alive, but not quite human. I couldn't take it anymore. One evening, after a particularly loud series of crashes and thuds, I couldn't resist. I grabbed my flashlight and went next door. This time, I wasn't going to back down. The doorbell rang again, and this time, there was no hesitation. I heard the footsteps approaching, slow, deliberate. The door opened again, but this time the man wasn't there. There was only the faint smell of something decaying, an odor I couldn't place, but that turned my stomach. I stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. The house was dark. The air inside was thick, stale, and unsettling. I turned on the flashlight, its beam cutting through the gloom, revealing old furniture draped in dusty sheets, boxes stacked haphazardly, and what appeared to be strange markings scratched into the walls. I hadn't seen these from outside. I took a few steps further in, my heart pounding. I needed answers. Suddenly, a noise came from upstairs, a dragging sound, like something being pulled slowly across the floor. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. I turned the corner, slowly, carefully, until I saw something that made my stomach churn. There, at the top of the staircase, was the neighbor. He was bent over, crawling toward me, his body moving in an unnatural, jerking manner. His face was now a mask of grotesque contortions, the skin stretched tight over his skull, his eyes black as coal, and his mouth twisted into an expression of hunger. And then he spoke. "Welcome home," he said in that same flat, emotionless tone. I froze, my flashlight shaking in my hand, casting erratic beams across the hallway. The words "welcome home" hung in the air like a grotesque invitation. The way he said it, so hollow, so lifeless, made my skin crawl. His movements were slow, deliberate, and unnatural, as if every inch of his body fought against its own instincts. I backed up a step, my pulse thundering in my ears, my mind racing with questions, confusion, and fear. What was he? Was this some kind of joke, a twisted prank? No, this was real. The way his body contorted as he moved, the unnatural calmness in his voice, it was not normal. I wanted to scream, but my voice was caught in my throat. Every instinct in me screamed to run, to get out of there as fast as I could. But my feet were glued to the floor, as though something invisible was holding me in place. I had to know what was happening. He crawled closer, his eyes fixed on mine, his gaze empty and cold. It was like looking into the abyss. There was no emotion, no humanity behind those eyes, just an endless void. The closer he got, the more I could feel the air around me thickening, heavy with some sort of oppressive presence. "Who? What are you?" I finally managed to whisper, the words coming out choked. His head tilted slightly, as if considering the question. Then, in a voice that sounded almost pleased, he said, "You're here now. That's all that matters." I took a step back, my heart racing. He wasn't just a man. He wasn't human. The realization hit me like a wave crashing down, drowning me in dread. But it was the sound behind me that made my blood run cold. A low, creaking noise from the corner of the room, followed by a soft scraping. Slowly, I turned to face it. In the darkness, something moved, slow, deliberate, like the weight of it was pressing against the walls. Shadows twisted and stretched unnaturally, forming shapes that shouldn't have existed. They looked almost like people, no like bodies, but their movements were jerky, spasming, like marionettes with tangled strings. They were crawling out from the corners, emerging from the walls themselves, their faces blank, their eyes wide, staring at nothing. I stumbled back, my legs unsteady beneath me. I had to leave. I had to get out. But when I turned back to the neighbor, I saw that he was standing now, tall, too tall. His limbs seemed stretched, elongated, like his bones were no longer his own. His face was the same, but it looked different now. Twisted. A cruel smile split his lips, revealing rows of teeth far too sharp for a human. No, I gasped, no, no, no. Before I could turn to flee, one of the shadowy figures reached out and grabbed my arm. I screamed and tried to pull away, but its grip was ironclad, cold and unyielding. Another figure grabbed my other arm, and soon I was trapped, held tight in place. The neighbor, or whatever it was, took a step closer. "You can't run from this," he said, his voice low and almost soothing. "You've already been marked. You're part of it now." I fought against the figures holding me, panic flooding my mind. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't move. My eyes darted around the room, looking for an escape. There had to be something. Then, as if responding to my desperation, I felt it. A chill, a sharp cold that seemed to come from the very walls of the house itself. It was like the house was alive, a living thing that could sense my fear, my dread. The scraping sound from earlier returned, louder now, closer. The air grew thick with a heavy, suffocating pressure, pressing against me from all sides. Suddenly, the neighbor lunged forward, grabbing my face with one cold, trembling hand. His fingers dug into my skin, sending a shock of ice through my entire body. "Stop fighting," he whispered, his breath cold against my ear. "You'll understand soon enough." The shadows around me started to move more violently, writhing like serpents. I could hear the low, guttural whispers of the figures in the dark, their voices overlapping, unintelligible, as if speaking in a language that wasn't meant for human ears. The pressure in the air intensified, and I felt my legs start to buckle under the weight of it. But then something unexpected happened. A sharp, sudden crack echoed through the house, the noise of something breaking. The hold the figures had on me loosened for just a moment, and that was all I needed. With everything I had left, I shoved forward, my body slamming into the nearest figure. It let out a low hiss as I broke free from its grip. I didn't look back. I didn't stop to check if I was being pursued. I ran. I didn't care about anything else except getting out of that house, away from the nightmare that was unfolding around me. The door was just ahead. I could see the faint outline of it, the outside world beckoning to me like a lifeline. As I reached the door, I felt the weight of something behind me, a presence that felt like it was closing in. I threw open the door and stumbled out into the yard, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't stop running. I didn't stop until I reached my own house, the door slamming shut behind me. I collapsed against the door, gasping for breath, my body shaking uncontrollably. I looked out the window toward the neighbor's house, expecting to see something, anything. But there was nothing, just the faint glow of the porch light. The house sat there, silent, still. I couldn't shake the feeling, though, that it was watching me, waiting for me. It wasn't over. I could still hear it in my mind, the scraping, the whispers, the voice that told me I was marked. The house next door had something dark inside of it, something that had never been human. And no matter how far I ran, no matter how fast I tried to escape, I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't safe. It wasn't over. The night stretched on, an endless, suffocating silence that filled my entire house. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, as if invisible eyes were trained on me from the dark, waiting for the right moment to strike. Every creak, every shift in the shadows seemed to whisper of something coming, something I couldn't escape. The neighbor's house stood there, silent, but I knew it wasn't truly empty. I paced the living room, unable to sit still. My thoughts kept returning to the shadowy figures, to that cold, predatory smile. I hadn't imagined it. It was real, every chilling moment of it. But what was he? What was the house? Why had it chosen me? The wind outside howled, rattling the windows, as if nature itself was trying to warn me. It was then that I noticed it. The faintest whisper, so soft, so low, it could have been the wind itself, but it wasn't. It came from the direction of the neighbor's house. "Join us." The word sent a shiver down my spine. I jumped up, running to the window, my heart racing. The house was still, like a dark sentinel in the night. But something was different. There was a faint light in one of the upstairs windows, the softest glow as though someone, or something, was watching from the shadows. I couldn't breathe. I felt my hands tremble, my mind scrambling for an explanation. There had to be one, something that would make sense of it all. Something that could explain why I was suddenly so connected to that house. Why it felt like it was calling to me. Then came another whisper, this time louder, clearer. It sent a ripple of cold through my veins. "Come back!" I pressed my hands to the window, my breath fogging the glass. Was it the neighbor speaking, or was it something far older, something far more sinister? The voice was wrong. It wasn't human. It was like an echo, a hollow sound that vibrated in my bones. I turned away from the window, my heart pounding. My mind was screaming at me to leave, to get as far away as possible. But then, another thought pierced through my panic. What if no one believes me? What if it's already too late? What had I gotten myself into? I grabbed my phone, trembling hands dialing my friend Mia. She lived a few blocks away, and maybe, just maybe, if I could talk to someone, I'd feel less alone in this nightmare. I needed someone to help me make sense of this, someone who could see what I was seeing, feel what I was feeling. The phone rang, and for a moment, there was a strange comfort in hearing it. But the seconds ticked by. The phone kept ringing. Then it stopped. A strange silence followed. Before I could redial, my phone vibrated in my hand, and I glanced down to see a message. It was from Mia. "I think I've figured it out. Meet me at the park. Something's wrong. Don't trust anyone." I froze. What did she mean by that? My mind raced. Had she seen something too? Was she? A loud knock on my front door cut through my thoughts, sharp and urgent. I froze, heart skipping a beat. The knocking was heavy, deliberate, like someone, or something, was determined to get my attention. I stood motionless for a moment, my mind whirling, but then the door rattled again, louder this time. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I walked slowly, cautiously, toward the door, each step feeling heavier than the last. As I reached for the handle, I felt a cold chill run through me. "Who is it?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. I gripped the doorknob, and my breath caught in my throat. Something about the silence on the other side felt wrong. Too wrong. And then, the door creaked open just enough for a whisper to escape the crack. "Join us." It was the same voice. That low, hollow, unmistakable whisper. I slammed the door shut, my heart hammering in my chest. The whisper continued, like an echo, filling the air with its chilling call. "Join us." I staggered back, my breath coming in sharp gasps. What was happening to me? Why was this voice so familiar, like it was crawling under my skin? And then a sudden crash. The sound came from upstairs, a loud thud followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Not just one set, but many. I turned and ran, heading straight for the stairs. There was no time to think, no time to wonder why I was even considering going upstairs. I had to face this. I had to know what was happening, even if it killed me. The footsteps continued, heavy and deliberate, growing louder as I ascended the stairs. I reached the top, my breath ragged in my chest. The hallway stretched out in front of me, the light from the one working lamp flickering, as if on the brink of going out. But it was the door at the end of the hall that drew my attention. The neighbor's door. It was slightly ajar, the faintest sliver of darkness visible through the crack. My pulse quickened. The air around me felt thick and oppressive, as though it was pushing against me, trying to force me back. But I couldn't stop now. With one last burst of courage, I crossed the threshold. The room was empty. At least, it seemed to be. But as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I noticed the shadows moving, shifting, in the corners of the room. They weren't natural, like the shadows in the rest of the house. These were wrong. They bent and twisted unnaturally, crawling along the walls, the floor. I stepped back, my breath caught in my throat. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind me, trapping me inside. The room was growing darker, the air growing heavier, colder. And then I saw him, the neighbor. He stood in the corner of the room, his eyes locked on mine, his face a twisted mockery of a smile. His body was barely visible in the growing darkness, but I could hear him, hear the ragged, gasping breaths coming from his mouth. "Welcome," he rasped, the word dragging itself from his throat like something ancient, something far beyond human understanding. "You've finally come home." And with that, the shadows surged toward me. The shadows writhed like living things, twisting and curling toward me with an almost hungry intensity. I couldn't move. My body felt like it was frozen in place, my legs too heavy to lift, my heart thundering in my chest. The air was thick, suffocating, as though the very room was trying to crush me. The neighbor's figure seemed to grow darker, almost blending into the shadows around him. His face was contorted, a grotesque mask of an expression that wasn't quite a smile, but more like something malicious, something that wanted to devour. "Why you? What are you?" I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. I tried to back away, but the door wouldn't open. My hands shook as I pressed against the handle, desperate to escape. But it was no use. He took a slow step forward, his movement unnaturally fluid, like he wasn't entirely tethered to reality. "I've been waiting," he rasped, his voice dripping with malice. "Waiting for you to see." The shadows stretched around me, pulling closer, their cold fingers brushing against my skin. It felt like they were alive, each one whispering to me in a language I didn't understand but somehow felt in my bones. The whispers grew louder, overlapping each other in a cacophony that rattled my mind. "Join us. You're just like us." I clenched my eyes shut, trying to block out the voices, but they seeped through, clawing at my thoughts, urging me to listen, to surrender. "No," I gasped, shaking my head. "I'm not like you." "Not yet," the neighbor said, his grin widening, stretching beyond the limits of a human face. "But you will be." I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet wouldn't obey. The shadows seemed to pull me down, dragging me into the darkness. The air was thick with their presence, like the very walls of the room were closing in on me. The neighbor stepped forward again, his eyes now glowing with an eerie, otherworldly light. He reached out, his long fingers brushing against my cheek. His touch was cold, unnaturally cold, like it came from something beyond the grave. "You've heard them," he said softly, his voice almost a purr. "The whispers. You've heard them your whole life, haven't you? That feeling, that pull." The whispering grew louder, rising to a deafening crescendo. I felt my resolve start to break, felt the tug of the darkness drawing me in. My head was spinning, my vision blurred. Suddenly, I heard a loud crash. The door! I turned to see the door had splintered open, the wood breaking apart under the force of someone on the other side. "Get away from her!" It was Mia's voice, sharp and filled with panic. The neighbor's eyes flicked toward the door, and for the briefest moment he seemed to hesitate. That was all the opening I needed. I stumbled backward, my body finally responding, and I ran toward the door. Mia was standing there, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. She didn't waste any time. She grabbed my arm and pulled me out of the room, slamming the door shut behind us. We didn't stop running. Mia dragged me down the hallway, past the dark rooms and into the stairwell. My heart was still pounding in my chest, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I could hear the neighbor's voice in the distance, calling after us, but I didn't dare look back. When we reached the front door, Mia didn't hesitate. She shoved it open, and we ran into the night air, gasping for breath. The moment we stepped outside, the oppressive weight of the house lifted, though the eerie feeling still clung to me like a second skin. Mia didn't say anything at first. We just stood there, catching our breath, the cold night air biting at our skin. I wanted to ask her what she knew, how she had gotten there, but I was too shaken to form words. Finally, she spoke, her voice trembling. "I've been watching him," she said. "Watching the house. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't understand until now." I glanced at her, confusion clouding my mind. "What do you mean? How do you know?" She turned her haunted eyes to me, her voice low and urgent. He's not human. None of them are. The house, they're all part of something older. Something dangerous." "What is it?" I whispered, my voice cracking. "Why me? Why did he choose me?" Mia took a deep breath, as if gathering the strength to say something she had been holding back. "You don't remember, do you?" she asked, her eyes searching mine. "The whispers, the ones that you've been hearing, even before you moved here." I shook my head, my mind reeling. The memories seemed so distant now, like something half forgotten. But I could feel them, whispers, that cold pull, like something was calling me from just out of sight. "He's been drawing you in for months," Mia continued. "The neighbor's house, the people who've lived there, they've all been part of something. The house has a way of calling to certain people, and once it has you, it never lets you go." The words were like ice water being poured over me. "What happens if I go back?" I asked, my voice trembling. "What happens to me?" Mia shook her head. "If you go back, you're lost. Forever." We stood there in silence, the weight of her words sinking in. The air felt heavier now, the world around us quiet in a way that wasn't natural. And then, from behind us, came the sound of footsteps. I turned quickly, fear flooding my chest. A figure was standing in the street behind us, just beyond the edge of the shadows. It was him, the neighbor. His grin stretched across his face, wide and terrifying. "You can run," he said, his voice low, "but you can never escape." Mia took a step forward, pushing me behind her. "We're not going back," she said, her voice filled with defiance. "Not now, not ever." The neighbor tilted his head, his smile never faltering. "Oh, but you will." And with that, the shadows seemed to grow deeper, the world around us darker, more suffocating. The whispers returned, filling the air, but now they were louder, closer. We were surrounded. I felt my legs give way beneath me, the weight of the situation pressing down, pulling me into the dark. Mia grabbed my hand, her grip tight, but I could feel the darkness slipping in around us, wrapping us in its cold embrace. The last thing I heard before the darkness swallowed us whole was the neighbor's voice, echoing in the void. "Join us." I couldn't breathe. The air had turned thick and stagnant, as though it had stopped flowing entirely. The pressure around me, the weight of the darkness, crushed me like a vice, and I felt my consciousness begin to slip, like I was sinking into something far worse than sleep. Mia's grip on my hand was the only thing anchoring me to reality. But even her touch felt distant now, like it was being swallowed up by the shadows, disappearing little by little. I tried to pull away, to free myself, but my limbs felt heavy, like I was walking through thick mud, unable to escape. The neighbor's voice echoed in the distance, distant yet impossibly close, each word crawling along my skin like icy fingers. "You'll see soon," he said, his tone almost affectionate. "It's only a matter of time. You'll join us. It's the way things work here." Mia's breath was ragged beside me. She was struggling too, but there was something different in her. She wasn't as helpless as I was. She was fighting it. "We can't let it pull us under," she muttered, her voice filled with determination. "We can't, or we'll be like the rest." I could barely focus on her words. The shadows around me were starting to take shape, twisting into forms, stretching out, wrapping themselves around my arms, my legs. They whispered, their voices too many to count, all speaking at once, but I couldn't understand them. It was all just noise now, buzzing in my mind like a swarm of bees. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I couldn't move. I couldn't even think. Everything was fading. "Don't you dare give in," Mia hissed, her voice cutting through the fog of confusion. "We're stronger than this." I felt her tug on my arm, and for the first time since the darkness closed in, something inside me fought back. I gathered the last bit of strength I had left and twisted my arm free from the shadow's grasp. The moment I did, the world seemed to flicker. I gasped, feeling a rush of air fill my lungs, and the oppressive pressure loosened slightly. It wasn't enough to escape, but it was enough to make me aware again. Mia was still gripping my hand, pulling me forward with every ounce of strength she had. "Come on," she urged, her voice strained. "We have to move." I nodded, forcing my legs to take a step, then another. The world around us seemed to shift and sway, like the ground beneath our feet was no longer solid. I could hear the neighbors' laughter from behind us, a deep, guttural sound that echoed through the night. "Run," Mia whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "If we stop, it'll be over." We ran, or at least we tried to. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the ground was trying to pull us back into the darkness. The whispers were still there, constant and unrelenting, scraping at my sanity, making it harder to focus. But I kept moving, driven by something deep inside me, something that refused to give in. I didn't dare look back. I didn't want to see him again. I didn't want to see those glowing eyes, that wicked grin. The thought of him made my stomach turn, made the air feel even colder. We ran through the streets, past the houses, past the trees, until we reached the edge of the neighborhood. It felt like we were running toward the edge of the world itself, like there was no more safe place to go. But I didn't care. I just wanted to be far, far away from that house, from that thing. Mia stopped suddenly, pulling me to a halt. I almost stumbled, my breath ragged as I tried to catch up with her. She was staring ahead, her eyes wide with terror. I followed her gaze and froze. The road ahead was blocked. A thick fog rolled in, dense and suffocating, swirling around us like something alive. It wasn't natural. It was like the fog itself was part of the dark force that had been chasing us. Where do we go now?" I asked, my voice small, my heart sinking. Mia didn't answer immediately. She just stood there, frozen, her face pale in the dim light. Then slowly she turned to me, her expression grim. "There's only one way left." I felt a chill run down my spine. I didn't want to hear it, but I knew what she meant. The only way left was the path that led to the house, the very place we had just tried to escape from, the place that had nearly swallowed us whole. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "We can't go back. It's too dangerous." "I know," Mia said softly, "but there's something you need to know. The only way to break free is to confront him, to face what he is." I felt my knees go weak. How? How can we do that? How can we stop him?" Mia's face was filled with sadness. "I don't know, but I've tried running before, and it never works. He'll find you. He always finds you." The fog thickened, and I could feel the darkness creeping closer, pressing in on us from all sides. The whispering had returned, more frantic now, clawing at my ears, urging me to surrender. I could feel its cold fingers wrapping around my chest, squeezing, tightening. "Stay close," Mia said, her voice steady even though her eyes were filled with fear. "And don't look back." We started moving again, slowly at first, the fog swirling around us like a living thing. My heart hammered in my chest, my fear rising with every step. I could feel something watching us, lurking just beyond the edge of the fog, waiting for the right moment to strike. But we kept going. We had no other choice. As we moved forward, I could feel the shadows, the cold, the whispers. They were all there surrounding us, but now there was something else. Something deeper. A a presence that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. Then I heard it, a soft sound at first, a rustling, a creak. It was coming from behind us. I turned my head just slightly, but I couldn't bring myself to look fully. I didn't want to know what was there. I knew what it was. I could feel it, and that's when I heard the voice again. "Running won't save you," it said softly, almost lovingly. "You belong to me now." The words sank into me like stones, heavy and cold, dragging my thoughts down into the depths of something dark. My legs faltered for just a second, my body freezing in place. The voice was unmistakable, the neighbor's voice, but somehow twisted now, different, colder. It wasn't just speaking anymore. It was in my head, in my blood, in the very marrow of my bones. Mia's hand gripped mine tightly, snapping me out of the momentary paralysis. "Don't listen to it," she urged, her voice strained, but filled with a fire that I couldn't match. "Keep moving." I didn't have the strength to argue, so I nodded, letting her pull me forward again. The fog had become thicker, more oppressive, swirling around our feet like a suffocating blanket. Each step felt like wading through molasses, every breath heavier than the last. And yet, the further we walked, the more the whispering seemed to grow, coming at us from every direction. It was as if the world itself was speaking, trying to drown us in its words, in its endless noise. "You're never truly free," the voice continued, floating on the air. "It's always been this way. Always will be." I wanted to scream, to tell it to shut up, but the words stuck in my throat. I couldn't give in. Not now. We were so close, I could feel it. The house, the terrible, cursed house, loomed just ahead, shrouded in fog. The place that had been our prison was now the only possible escape. It was the only place that might hold the answers. "We're almost there," Mia said, her voice barely audible over the whispers. I could hear the tension in her words, the barely contained fear that she was trying to hide. But she was right. We had no choice but to go forward. I kept my eyes fixed ahead, focusing on the dark silhouette of the house emerging through the fog, its crooked shape almost welcoming now. We weren't running anymore. We couldn't. Every time I tried to speed up, my legs felt as if they were being held back by invisible chains. The pressure was unbearable, like something was slowly crushing me from the inside out. The front door of the house stood wide open. I could feel the chill of the night air seeping from it, as though the house was exhaling, drawing us back into its cold embrace. Mia stopped in front of it, her breath ragged. "This is it," she said, looking at me, her eyes filled with something I couldn't place, fear, but also something else. A strange kind of resolve. I nodded, though my heart was pounding so loudly I thought it might burst from my chest. I felt sick, dizzy, but I couldn't stop now. We had to face whatever this was. We had to end it before it ended us. We stepped inside. The door closed behind us with an unnerving finality, cutting off the last of the outside world. The house smelled like old wood, musty and decayed, but there was something else underneath it, something metallic like blood. "Where is he?" I whispered, my voice barely more than a breath. I didn't want to say it out loud. The house felt alive, every creak of the floorboards echoing through the silence, every shadow stretching longer than it should. Mia's grip tightened on my hand. "I don't know, but we need to find him. It's the only way." We moved through the dark, each step echoing in the empty space. The air grew colder, thicker, the walls themselves seeming to close in around us. There were no windows, no light, except the faint glow from the doorway behind us. And the whispering. It was louder now, coming from the walls themselves, from the floors, the ceiling. "You can't escape," the voice whispered. "You belong to me. All of you." I shuddered, the sound of those words crawling up my spine like insects. But we kept moving, following the narrow, winding hallway, past doors that led nowhere. Each room was darker than the last, colder, filled with a palpable sense of wrongness. Finally, we reached the end of the hall. A door stood in front of us, cracked open, as if inviting us inside. I could feel something stirring behind it, something waiting, something old and powerful. Mia stepped forward, her hand trembling as she reached for the door. "This is it," she whispered. "We have to do this." She pushed the door open. What we saw inside made my blood run cold. It wasn't just a room. It was the room. The one that I had seen in my dreams, in flashes of memory that felt both familiar and foreign. The walls were lined with pictures, dozens of them, old, faded photographs of people, their faces distorted, eyes wide with fear. There were more than I could count, but they all had one thing in common. They were all staring at something out of frame, something that made their eyes bulge with terror. And then I saw it. In the center of the room was the neighbor. His body was twisted, impossibly contorted, his limbs bending at odd angles as if they were made of rubber. His skin was pale, waxy, and there were dark veins crawling up his neck, beneath his eyes, like the blood itself had turned black. His face, his real face, was no longer the shape of a man. It was something else, something alien, like it had been ripped from another world and forced to wear the skin of a human. "You're too late," he said, his voice a gurgling hiss, his mouth stretching unnaturally wide. "You belong to me now." His eyes gleamed with a sickening hunger, his smile widening as he reached for us. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. My body wouldn't respond. I was frozen, trapped in the presence of something too awful to comprehend. But Mia didn't hesitate. She pushed me aside, grabbing something off the floor, a jagged piece of glass. Without a word, she lunged at him, stabbing it deep into his chest. The neighbor's body jerked violently, his inhuman scream filling the room, a sound so piercing it shattered my thoughts. His skin began to crack, black veins snaking up from the wound. The room itself seemed to tremble, the air thick with a palpable sense of wrongness. But it wasn't enough. With a final, terrible roar, the neighbor collapsed to the floor, his body twitching and spasming as his form seemed to collapse in on itself. The air grew colder still, and the shadows in the room began to twist and churn, moving like living things. "It's not over," Mia whispered, her voice shaking. "We need to destroy it completely." And that's when the true horror began. The shadows in the room seemed to pulse, their movements growing more frantic, as if the very essence of the house was alive and fighting back. The air grew thick, and the walls seemed to close in on us, pressing in with an almost suffocating weight. I could hear the floorboards creaking under the strain, the house itself groaning as if it were in pain. Mia stepped back, her eyes wide with disbelief and terror. It's not over," she repeated, almost to herself. "We have to finish this." I could feel the panic rising in my chest. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think clearly. The room had become a nightmare, a distortion of reality, where nothing made sense. The neighbor's body lay in the center, twitching violently, and the shadows swirled around it like hungry spirits, eager to consume whatever remained. We were not alone. I could feel something watching us from the corners of the room, something far darker and older than any living thing. I turned toward the door, desperate for an escape, but the doorway had vanished, swallowed by the same thick, creeping darkness that was now swallowing the entire room. "Run!" Mia screamed, pulling me back toward the center of the room, away from the door that no longer existed. But I couldn't move. My legs were frozen, as if the floor had turned to stone beneath me, and my heart hammered in my chest, a deafening drumbeat that drowned out everything else. I looked at Mia, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror, but there was no time to comfort her, no time to explain. We were trapped. The floor beneath us cracked open with a loud, resounding snap. A long, dark crevice spread like a wound across the ground, and from the depths of it, a cold, unnatural wind blew, sending my hair flying. The whispering was louder now, overwhelming, echoing from every corner, every crack in the walls. It was a symphony of voices, layered on top of each other, chanting a single, unholy word over and over again. "Join us." I reached out, trying to hold on to something, anything, but my fingers grasped only air. Mia had fallen to her knees, clutching at her ears, trying to block out the noise. Her face was streaked with tears, her breath coming in ragged gasps. We have to end it," she whispered. "It's the only way." But as she spoke, the shadows began to shift again. They morphed into shapes, human shapes, twisted and deformed. Figures that moved, their limbs bent at odd angles, crawling on the floor and walls like something from a fevered dream. The room was filled with them now, dozens of them, ghostly, faceless things with empty eyes that glowed a sickly, unnatural light. I heard the sound of footsteps behind me, slow, deliberate. I turned, and there, standing in the corner, was the neighbor, or what was left of him. His body was no longer human. It was a grotesque mockery of a man, his skin stretched tight across bones that seemed too large, too long. His eyes were black pits, endless voids that seemed to suck in all the light around him. His mouth was open wide, his lips stretching too far, too thin, as he let out a sound that was part scream, part laughter. "You're mine," the creature whispered, its voice cracking, as if it were speaking from the depths of some dark abyss. "All of you, forever." Mia didn't wait. With a cry of desperation, she lunged forward, grabbing a shard of broken glass from the floor. She thrust it toward the creature, but as it made contact with his chest, the glass shattered, its pieces scattering across the floor like grains of sand. The creature didn't flinch. It only smiled, a horrible, jagged smile that stretched impossibly wide. "You cannot stop it," it said, its voice like gravel. "You will join us, and you will never leave." The walls began to crack, splintering, breaking apart as if the house itself was being torn from the inside out. The shadows, the figures, the whispers, they all closed in on us, surrounding us, trapping us in an ever-tightening circle. The very air seemed to vibrate with the pressure, the weight of something ancient and evil pressing down on us, suffocating us. Mia screamed, her voice raw, desperate. "We have to destroy it. We have to burn it." I looked around, but there was nothing. No escape. Nothing that could save us from this nightmare. The house was alive, and it was hungry. I could feel it now, something ancient, something powerful, coursing through the very foundation of the house. A force that had been here long before any of us, long before the first family had ever stepped foot in this cursed place. A presence that had been waiting, watching, feeding on the fear and despair of everyone who had ever come here. The creature, the neighbor, slowly advanced, its limbs bending at unnatural angles, dragging itself closer to us. It reached out with a hand that seemed to elongate, its fingers clawing at the air like tendrils, grasping for us. "Join us, join us." It hissed. I could feel it. The pull. It was like gravity, like something stronger than my will was pulling me toward the creature, toward the darkness, toward that terrible thing that had once been a man. Mia was screaming, but I couldn't hear her over the deafening roar of the whispers. "Join us," it repeated, its voice a siren call that threatened to shatter my mind. And then something inside me snapped. I couldn't do it. I couldn't let it take me. I couldn't let it take Mia. I fought back with everything I had left, every ounce of strength I could summon. I pushed her aside, shoving her toward the dark, cracked door that had appeared behind us, the only way out. "Go!" I shouted, my voice hoarse. "Run!" Mia hesitated, tears streaming down her face, but I shoved her once more, forcing her toward the door. "Go!" I screamed. The creature hissed behind me, its clawed hand outstretched, but I was already turning, grabbing whatever I could find. The room was filled with debris, old furniture, broken glass, rusted pipes, but there was nothing that could stop what was coming. Mia screamed again, and the sound of her terror seemed to pierce through the madness. But it was too late. The darkness closed in. The last thing I saw was Mia disappearing through the door, her silhouette swallowed by the crushing darkness. I didn't know if she had made it out, if she was even still alive. I didn't have the time to think about it. The creature, if it could still be called that, was almost upon me, its hideous, elongated limbs reaching for me with a speed that defied logic. My body moved on instinct. I couldn't think, couldn't process what was happening around me. There was only the creature's deep, guttural breath and the relentless, overwhelming darkness that clawed at my very soul. I ran, stumbled, and fell, scrambling across the floor, trying to find anything at all, that might help. But the house was no longer a house. It had become something else entirely, a living, breathing entity that had only one purpose: to consume, to trap, to feed. As I ran, I could hear the shadows whispering again, louder this time, calling my name, urging me to join them. The walls seemed to stretch and warp around me, twisting in unnatural ways, as if the house itself were trying to swallow me whole. I turned down a hallway, desperate to find an exit, but the corridor seemed endless. The walls were closing in on me, the air thick with the stench of rot. Each step I took felt heavier than the last, as if the house was pulling me into its depths. I could hear the creature's footsteps now, slow and deliberate, like it was toying with me. Its breath was hot against my neck, sending shivers of pure terror down my spine. "Join us," the creature hissed, its voice echoing in my mind. "You are one of us now." I couldn't breathe. The words were suffocating me. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel the cold, skeletal fingers of despair wrapping around my throat. And then I saw it. At the end of the hallway there was a door. It wasn't just any door. It was a door that had never been there before, a door that hadn't been there when I first entered the house. It was a thick, heavy wooden door, worn with age, but there was something about it that felt right. It was the only thing that seemed to lead somewhere, anywhere, that wasn't the abyss. I ran toward it, each step an eternity, my body aching, my lungs burning for air. The whispers were louder now, desperate, maddened. I could feel the shadows crawling on my skin, biting into me with invisible teeth. But I reached the door, my hands trembling as I turned the handle and pulled it open. What I saw beyond the door nearly made my heart stop. The room on the other side was empty, completely empty. No furniture, no walls. Just an infinite blackness that stretched out in all directions, an endless void that seemed to consume everything it touched. There was no light, no sound, just the oppressive weight of nothingness. But within that darkness there was something else. A shape. A form, vague and shifting, at the center of the room. A figure standing tall, unmoving, waiting. It was the same figure I had seen earlier, the neighbor, or whatever it was that had replaced him. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, two pinpricks of light that seemed to draw me in, to pull me toward it with a force greater than my own will. The door slammed shut behind me with a deafening crash, sealing me inside the void. I couldn't move. My legs were frozen, my mind racing with fear and disbelief. There was no way out. There was no escape. The figure spoke, its voice like 1,000 whispers, each one echoing in my mind. "You belong here now." I wanted to scream, to fight, to do anything to get away from it. But I couldn't. I was trapped in its gaze, its presence, like a puppet bound by invisible strings. "Join us," it repeated, its voice growing louder, more forceful. "You are one of us now." The air around me grew colder, and the shadows seemed to press in from all sides, suffocating, stifling every breath. I felt myself being pulled closer, my feet dragging across the floor, as though I were sinking into quicksand. The whispers grew louder, no longer separate voices, but one unified, unholy chant that reverberated through my very bones. I closed my eyes, trying to shut out the torment, but it didn't help. The pull was too strong. My mind was unraveling, my thoughts scattering like leaves in the wind. The darkness began to swirl, and I felt it closing in on me, tightening around me, drowning me in its weight. I reached out for anything to hold on to, but there was nothing, just the endless void and the mocking, insistent whispers. "You can't escape," the figure said. "You belong here with us." The shadows surged forward, enveloping me, dragging me into the abyss. And then, Just as I thought I would lose myself completely, I heard a voice. A faint, distant voice, Mia's voice. Don't let it take you. It was the last thing I heard before everything went black. The darkness that swallowed me was thick, suffocating, like being wrapped in a heavy, wet blanket. My mind spun in confusion, and I couldn't tell if I was awake or trapped in some endless nightmare. I was drifting, floating, weightless, with no sense of direction, no sense of time. The only thing that remained constant was the cold. Then I felt it, a sharp, biting sensation on my skin. It felt like ice crawling over every inch of my body, and I gasped for air, for reality, for anything. My limbs jerked as if I were being dragged from the depths of that suffocating blackness, pulled into something more solid, more real. I opened my eyes, but I didn't recognize what I saw. I was no longer in the void. I was back in the house. No, not the house I remembered. This was a version of it, twisted and broken, as if it had been warped by some malevolent force. The walls were cracked, like they had been stretched too far, and the ceiling seemed to pulse, breathing in time with some invisible rhythm. There was no light, but I could see everything, strange, shadowy figures in the corners of the room, just beyond the reach of my vision, watching me. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't respond, as if it were weighed down by an unseen force. And then I heard it, the whispers. They were no longer distant or vague. They were right next to me, in my ears, swirling in my mind. Hundreds, no thousands, of voices, all speaking at once, overlapping and blending into a single deafening roar. Join us. I tried to scream, but no sound came. I opened my mouth, but it felt like I was underwater, my words muffled and lost. I could feel the cold crawling up my spine, creeping into my very bones. The neighbor's face appeared before me, distorted, stretched into a grotesque mask. His eyes glowed with that same faint light, and his smile was wide, too wide, impossibly wide. His voice came again, soft and terrible. You cannot fight it. It's already inside you. I closed my eyes, trying to block him out, trying to block out the whispers, the overwhelming sense of dread that was suffocating me. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape it. Join us. The house, the thing that had once been a house, groaned as if it were alive, its walls moving, bending, shifting. The floor beneath me cracked open again, and from the abyss below, I could hear something stirring, something large and ancient, something that had been waiting for centuries. I knew what it was. The house wasn't just haunted. It was the anchor, the vessel, the place where the darkness had taken root. And now, it was pulling me into it. I tried to move, to stand, but it felt like the floor itself was gripping me, holding me in place. My legs wouldn't cooperate. My mind was too foggy, too clouded by the whispers, the fear, the pull. And then I saw something else. In the corner of the room, partially hidden in the shadows, was a door. A door I hadn't seen before, a door that didn't belong. The door was made of dark, aged wood, its surface scarred and worn, as though it had been standing for centuries. And behind it, there was a faint light, a glow that beckoned, that promised escape. It was all I had left. I fought against the weight in my limbs, pushing myself to stand, forcing my legs to carry me toward that door. My heart pounded in my chest, my breathing shallow and panicked. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, but I didn't listen. I couldn't. Each step I took felt like I was wading through thick mud. The shadows clawed at me, but I kept moving, kept fighting against the pull. The door was getting closer, but it felt like I would never reach it. And then, just as I was about to touch the handle, the shadows surged forward, faster than I could react. I stumbled back, falling to the ground, and felt cold hands, thousands of them, gripping my body, pulling me back into the depths. The figure, the neighbor, was there again, towering over me, his face now twisted into something monstrous, something inhuman. His mouth opened wide, wider than before, and he spoke in that same terrible voice. "You can't escape," he hissed. "You belong here, just like all the others." I was paralyzed, the terror freezing me to the spot. The darkness was closing in, swallowing everything around me. But then, through the suffocating blackness, I heard a sound. A familiar sound. It was Mia's voice. "Mia?" I whispered, my voice barely audible, barely a breath. I couldn't see her, but I could feel her presence, faint but real. I could hear her calling to me, urging me forward. I shook my head, forcing myself to focus. Mia, she was still alive. She was still out there. I couldn't give up. Not now. Not when there was still hope. I rose to my feet, ignoring the creature's reach, ignoring the shadows that tried to drag me down. I stumbled toward the door, the whispers now nothing more than a distant hum, as though they no longer had any power over me. My fingers touched the handle, and I twisted it with all the strength I could muster. The door opened. The light from beyond poured in, flooding the room, pushing back the darkness. I didn't look back. I didn't have time to. I ran. And as I crossed the threshold, the whispers, the shadows, the house, all of it vanished. For the first time in what felt like forever, I could breathe. I could see. I was free. But I knew deep down that I wasn't completely safe. The house, the neighbor, the darkness, they were still out there waiting, watching. The door had closed behind me, but I wasn't sure if it had really been the end. The whispers still echoed in my mind, faint but constant. And as I looked around, taking in the world that had seemed so familiar just hours before, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. That it wasn't over. Not yet. I stood in the clearing, the light spilling around me, but it felt hollow, unnatural. The air smelled different now, fresher, yes, but somehow tainted with something I couldn't place. The peaceful hum of the world outside the house seemed to mock me, like I was still trapped in some half-forgotten dream. I stumbled backward, my feet brushing against the wet grass, unsure of where I was or how I had gotten here. I looked around for any sign of Mia, but she was nowhere to be seen. No lights, no sounds, just an eerie silence that wrapped itself around me like a thick fog. Had I really escaped? The questions echoed in my mind, circling with no answers. The darkness, the creature, the house, they felt like a distant memory now, but they weren't gone. I knew that deep inside. It was as if something had followed me, hidden just beneath the surface of the world I had once known. The whispers had stopped, but the sense of being watched never left. I couldn't shake the feeling that the house, it was still there, waiting for me. Even as the wind stirred the trees and the sun began to dip lower in the sky, a cold knot tightened in my chest. No matter how far I ran, no matter how many doors I shut, I knew it was never truly gone. It could never be erased. I took a shaky step forward, breathing in the cool air. The world around me still felt wrong. The shadows seemed to lengthen unnaturally, twisting in ways they shouldn't. The sun was setting, but there was no warm glow on the horizon. Only a dark, ashen sky. And then I saw something, a figure in the distance. It was barely visible at first, just a silhouette standing motionless in the twilight. My heart skipped a beat. It couldn't be, but it was. The neighbor. The thing that had once been my neighbor, the creature that had haunted the very air I breathed, stood at the edge of the forest. His eyes glowed faintly, unmistakable even from this distance. His silhouette was tall, twisted, like the branches of a tree, reaching out, beckoning. My feet were rooted to the spot. I wanted to run, to hide, but I couldn't. Something held me there, something stronger than fear, stronger than the terror that had once consumed me. He tilted his head, as if studying me, his eyes narrowing with a dark intent. Then he spoke. "You cannot escape," his voice echoed, soft but chilling, as if it had been whispered in my ear. "You are part of this now. There is no freedom. There is no way out." His words sank into me like ice, and for the first time, I realized what he had meant. The house had been only a doorway, a threshold, but it wasn't just a house. It wasn't just a place. It was a gateway. I felt my body tremble, but I couldn't move. The ground beneath me seemed to shift, as though the earth itself was opening up, preparing to swallow me whole. The air around me grew thick, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer, thicker, swirling around the figure who stood just beyond the edge of the trees. The creature's grin spread wider, impossibly wide. "You're not free," it whispered. "You never were." I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. I was paralyzed, unable to react, unable to do anything but watch as he moved closer. His form twisted and undulated, his movements fluid and alien. I could hear the distant murmur of voices again, so faint, so soft. But this time, it wasn't just one voice. It was a chorus of them, all calling my name, all urging me to come closer, to join them, to become one with the darkness. And then, without warning, he lunged at me. The ground beneath me cracked, and I could feel the pull of the abyss, the very weight of it dragging me down. But then, just as quickly, the world around me shattered. The sky split open with a sound like thunder, and the creature froze, caught in the moment. The ground around us shifted violently, as though the earth itself was rebelling against whatever it was that had claimed it. The shadows screamed. I gasped for air as the world trembled, the walls of reality twisting and bending like paper caught in a storm. I was falling, no, being pulled, into something beyond this world. The darkness, the creature, the whispers, they all felt like they were closing in on me. And then, just as quickly, everything stopped. I was back in the house. The walls were silent, the air still. The once chaotic world around me had returned to its eerie calm. The room was empty. I was standing in the center of the living room, the same place I had been moments, or was it hours, before. But something was different. The silence was suffocating, the emptiness overwhelming. The house had returned to its original state, but there was no sense of relief. It wasn't a sanctuary. It wasn't home. I heard a faint sound, a door creaking open. It was far off, muffled, but unmistakable. The floorboards groaned under the weight of someone, or something, moving through the house. My heart began to race again. I moved slowly, cautiously, toward the source of the sound. Every step felt heavier than the last, like the house itself was watching, listening. The door to the hallway was cracked open, the faint light from the other side barely visible. I reached for the handle, but before I could touch it, I heard the voice again. This time, it wasn't the neighbor's voice. It was Mia's. "Don't open it," she whispered, her voice strained, desperate. "It's not the same. It's still here. It never left." I froze. I knew she was right, but I couldn't stop. I had to know what was behind that door. With a trembling hand, I pushed it open. Beyond it was a room I didn't recognize. It was dark, cold, and filled with a strange, metallic scent. Shadows moved within the room, twisting and curling around unseen objects. And in the center of the room, standing still as if waiting, was the figure. Not the neighbor. Something worse. The darkness had followed me. The figure in the center of the room was unlike anything I had ever seen before. Its shape was indistinct, constantly shifting as though it was made from the very darkness itself. At first, I thought it might just be a trick of the light, a shadow cast by something in the room. But no, this thing moved. Its form was roughly humanoid, but it was stretched, elongated, twisted in a way that made it feel wrong. It had no distinct features, only dark, swirling emptiness where its face should have been. Its limbs were impossibly long, jagged, and wrong, bending at angles that didn't make sense. And it was staring at me. No, not staring, watching. Its movements were slow, deliberate, as though it were savoring every moment of my fear. The longer I stood there, frozen, the more I felt like I was being suffocated by its presence. I could feel its gaze. It wasn't a physical sensation. It wasn't like someone was looking at me, but rather that it knew me, that it had always known me. The air around me grew colder, the temperature dropping so quickly that I could see my breath in the air. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, to escape, but my feet were glued to the floor. My body was paralyzed with fear, my heart hammering in my chest, the blood rushing to my ears as I struggled to make sense of what I was seeing. Then, without warning, the figure moved. It didn't walk, didn't glide, it scrambled, dragging itself across the floor in jerky, unnatural motions. It was fast, faster than anything I had ever seen, and before I could even react, it was inches from me. I backed away, my legs stumbling against the floor as I tried to make space, but it was too late. The thing raised one of its arms, and in that moment, I could see that it wasn't a hand at all. It was just a mass of black tendrils, twisting and writhing, each one like an extension of the darkness itself. They reached for me, curling in on themselves as if they had a mind of their own, and I could hear a soft, almost inaudible whispering as they drew closer. It was like the house was breathing, the walls moving in time with the creature's presence. The very air seemed to vibrate with a hum, as though the darkness itself had a pulse. I reached out, trying to push the tendrils away, but they were too strong, wrapping around my wrists like chains, pulling me in. The whispers grew louder, louder until they were a cacophony, a chorus of voices all speaking at once, each one more desperate than the last. "Join us," they urged. "Become part of the house." I fought against it, my heart racing in my chest. I could feel the coldness of the tendrils, the way they seemed to drain all warmth from my body, making everything around me feel more distant. The world began to fade. No, it wasn't fading, it was shifting. The room around me warped, stretched, twisted, and I felt myself being pulled into another place. A place where the boundaries between life and death, reality and nightmare, had no meaning. And then I heard it, a sound, familiar, soft, Mia's voice. "Run," she whispered. It was a hoarse whisper, but I knew it was her. She was in there, somewhere, and she was trying to help me. With every ounce of strength I could muster, I jerked my body, pulling my arms free from the tendrils that held me. The darkness around me screeched, the sound like nails on a chalkboard as I broke free. I stumbled backward, my vision spinning, my legs shaking beneath me. I turned to run, but the room wasn't the same anymore. The walls were no longer solid. They undulated like liquid, shifting with the rhythm of the thing in the center of the room. It was everywhere. It was the room, the house, the presence that had taken root in this place. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. The whispers filled my mind, drowning out everything else. They were so loud now, so overwhelming. "Join us." "No," I whispered through clenched teeth. "I won't join you." But the voice wasn't just in my ears anymore. It was inside my head, 1,000 voices all whispering the same thing. "Join us. Become part of the house." I took another step back, my mind struggling to hold on to reality, trying to make sense of what was happening. But it was impossible. The house was alive, and it wanted me. It wanted all of us. I turned again, facing the door, and in that moment of pure panic, I ran. I didn't look back. I didn't stop to consider anything. My only thought was to escape. I threw open the door and sprinted down the hallway, my footsteps echoing against the walls. Behind me, I could hear the screeching of the thing in the room, its claws scraping against the floor, but I refused to look. The hallway seemed endless, twisting and turning in ways that made no sense. Each corner felt like a new nightmare, like the house itself was trying to swallow me whole. And then I saw it. The door. The front door. I ran toward it, my hands shaking as I reached for the handle. But just as I was about to pull it open, the door slammed shut. It wasn't locked. It wasn't barred. It was as if something pushed it closed. I slammed my shoulder against the door, but it wouldn't budge. I turned, desperate, and there it was, the thing, standing at the far end of the hallway watching me. Its tendrils reached out, extending toward me like the claws of a monster, and I could feel the cold air around me closing in. "Join us," it hissed. And then something shifted in me. I remembered Mia's voice. She had warned me. She had told me to run, to leave the house behind. With everything I had left, I charged at the door. My fist collided with the wood, and for the first time something gave. The door flew open, and I was out. The sun was setting in the distance, casting long shadows across the front lawn. The house stood behind me, silent, waiting. But I didn't care anymore. I didn't look back. I ran. I didn't stop until I reached the end of the street, until the house was nothing more than a speck in the distance. But even then I could feel it. The presence, the whispers, they lingered in my mind, in my heart, in the very air around me. And I knew. It wasn't over. I could feel it in the air, like a constant weight pressing down on my chest. The further I ran, the more it felt like I was being followed. Not physically, but spiritually. The whispers, that same haunting chant, began to echo in the back of my mind. Join us. It called, as if it were no longer just the house that wanted me. It was everything. The world, the air itself, the very ground beneath my feet. I tried to shake it off, tried to push the thoughts away, but the harder I ran, the louder the voices became. They weren't just whispers anymore. They were like a chorus of maddening screams, urging me towards something I couldn't even understand. I stumbled, breath ragged, and finally stopped when I reached the small park at the edge of town. The cool night air stung my lungs, but it felt like a moment of clarity, a brief break from the horror that was still clawing at my thoughts. I collapsed onto a bench, gripping the edges of the wood as though it could anchor me to reality. My heart pounded in my chest, my legs trembling beneath me. I wanted to break down, to scream, but no sound came. The park was eerily still, the faint rustle of the wind the only thing disturbing the silence. And then the air shifted. I could feel it before I saw it. The temperature dropped. A shadow passed over the moon, blocking out the light for just a moment, and then there it was, that feeling again. It was as if the world around me had stopped breathing. The whispers had followed me, stretching out from the house like invisible tendrils, crawling beneath my skin. It was everywhere. The park, the town, the night, and then I saw it. In the far distance, at the edge of the trees near the park's edge, I saw the figure again. The same shape, the same shadow. It was distant but unmistakable. It wasn't just a trick of the light. It was real. The thing was still watching me. My heart skipped a beat. I was no longer alone. It had followed me. The house, it was still connected to me. I wasn't free. The thing began to move slowly, silently. As it did, the shadows around it stretched unnaturally long, as if the darkness itself was bending to its will. I could feel my breath catch in my throat. Panic surged again, and I jumped to my feet, backing away, my legs barely holding me up. "Go away!" I shouted, the words coming out in a ragged gasp. My voice felt small, useless against the enormity of whatever was watching me. But the figure didn't stop. It never slowed, never hesitated. It was coming toward me, and now I could see it more clearly. It wasn't just one figure anymore. There were others. Shadowy figures, far in the distance, emerging from the edges of the trees, from the darkness that spilled out across the park. They weren't human. I could tell that even from here. Their forms were twisted, distorted, like crude imitations of people, their limbs elongated, their faces barely visible, if they had faces at all. It was like the house had somehow spilled out into the world, infecting everything around me. These things, whatever they were part of it, and they were coming for me. I turned and ran, but this time, I didn't make it far. My legs felt heavy, like I was running through molasses. Each step seemed slower than the last, as if the earth itself was pulling me back. I glanced over my shoulder, and they were getting closer. The shadows were closing in. The air was suffocating. And then I heard it. A voice, clear and loud this time. Not a whisper, but a scream. A desperate, familiar scream. "Mia!" I cried, but it was too late. Before I could react, the figure that had been watching me stepped forward, its shape blurring as it moved. It was faster than before, impossibly fast, and it reached out for me with a hand. Or rather, a mass of writhing black tendrils. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped. The tendrils wrapped around my throat, around my wrists, pulling me toward it. My heart raced, panic flooding my senses, but I couldn't break free. The darkness consumed me, filled my lungs, my mind, my soul. Then, everything went still. I don't know how long I was unconscious. When I opened my eyes again, I was back at the house. It felt like a dream at first, a nightmare I was struggling to wake from. But as my vision cleared, I saw that it wasn't a dream. It was real. I was standing in the same hallway I had fled earlier, the one with the dark walls and the cold, suffocating air. The house, it felt different now. It was no longer just a place I had escaped from. It was a presence, an oppressive force that had me now. I could hear the whispers again. They were louder now, closer. They weren't just in my mind anymore. They were real, surrounding me, suffocating me. "Join us," they murmured. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't respond. I couldn't scream, couldn't run. I felt like I was being pulled into the house, as though the walls themselves were coming alive to consume me. I saw it then, the thing, standing in the center of the hallway, a distorted version of the figure that had chased me. Its limbs were impossibly long, twisted in ways that no human body could move. Its face was still nothing but darkness, but I could feel it, its eyes, its gaze. And then it spoke. "You are one of us now," it said, its voice deep, like the earth itself was speaking. The walls around me seemed to close in, the floor beneath my feet giving way as I fell. I reached out, but there was nothing to grab. I was falling into the endless dark, and the last thing I heard before everything went black was the sound of Mia's voice. "Join us." I don't know how long I was gone. It could have been minutes, hours, or days. Time seemed irrelevant in this place, this nightmare. When I woke up, I was lying on a cold, stone floor, my entire body aching. It took me a moment to gather my bearings, but the overwhelming sensation of dread never left. The whispers were gone now, but I could still feel them lingering, like a faint buzzing in the back of my mind, threatening to resurface at any moment. I pushed myself up, my hands trembling as I placed them on the rough, uneven stone beneath me. The air smelled musty, like decay and dust. The room was dimly lit by the faint glow of a few scattered, flickering candles. The walls were thick, old stone, like a crypt or some forgotten cellar, and the air was so heavy it felt like it could suffocate me. For a moment, I thought I was dreaming again, trapped in another layer of nightmare. But as my senses sharpened, I realized this was all too real. This place wasn't a dream. I heard the sound of distant footsteps, soft but rhythmic, like the padding of bare feet on stone. They were coming closer. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest. My eyes darted around the room, looking for an escape, but there was nothing. The walls were too high, the windows too small to fit through. There was no way out. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I could feel my skin crawling, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. And then I saw them. Two figures emerged from the shadows, walking slowly into the dim light. I didn't recognize them, but their presence was suffocating, like the weight of their gaze alone could crush me. Their faces were obscured by hoods, but I could feel their eyes, watching, waiting. I could almost hear their silent judgment. One of them, the taller figure, stepped forward. They didn't speak at first, just stood there, watching me with an eerie stillness that made my stomach turn. "You've made it this far," the voice finally spoke, low and gravelly, echoing in the silence. It was an unsettling sound, as if it had come from somewhere deep within the earth. I wanted to ask what they meant, but my throat was dry, my voice barely a whisper when I tried. "What is this place?" I managed to choke out. The taller figure tilted its head slightly, almost as if considering the question. Then, in a voice that sent chills down my spine, they answered. "This is where they all end up," it said. "The ones who hear the whispers. The ones who can't resist. The ones who join." I whispered, my breath catching in my throat. A low chuckle emanated from the figure. "Yes," it said, "you're here now, and you will never leave." The words hit me like a physical blow, and I stumbled back, my legs shaking beneath me. There was no escape. The figure's words settled in like a weight, and I realized with terrible clarity that I was no longer just a victim of whatever force had been haunting the house. I was part of it. I had been chosen. "No!" I shouted, desperation rising in my chest. "I don't belong here. I can't be like them." I was shaking now, my breath ragged. I couldn't bear it. I couldn't stand the thought of becoming just another shadow, another twisted figure in the dark. But the figure only stared at me, its eyes hidden beneath the hood, its presence overwhelming. The air in the room seemed to grow thicker, more suffocating. The whispers returned, louder now, more insistent. "Join us. Join us. You belong to us." I tried to cover my ears, but the voices pierced my mind, filling every inch of my thoughts, clawing their way deeper into my consciousness. It felt like the walls were closing in on me again, pressing me into the ground. I could hear their cries, the voices of those who had come before me, all of them, all trapped in this place, bound to the house forever. "No!" I screamed again, my voice breaking. I won't join you." The room seemed to pulse with energy, and for a moment, I thought I was going to suffocate under the weight of it. The candles flickered wildly, the shadows growing longer and darker, as if the very darkness itself was alive. The air grew cold, so cold it burned, and I could feel the grip of whatever force had claimed this place tightening around me. But then, as if by some miracle, I felt something, a small sliver of resistance, a faint glimmer of hope. I could still fight. I pushed myself to my feet, gasping for air, my hands clenched into fists. The two figures in front of me didn't move, didn't speak, just watched. But I didn't care. I couldn't let them take me. I couldn't let this nightmare become my reality. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the stone floor, the echo of my steps mingling with the whispers that clawed at my mind. The room stretched on, but I kept running, pushing past the shadows, pushing past the suffocating darkness. And then finally, I reached the door. I threw myself against it, my shoulders slamming into the wood, but it didn't budge. I was trapped again. "No!" I screamed. "Let me out!" I battered against the door, my fists bloody and raw, but it wouldn't open. It was as if the house itself was resisting me, holding me in place. But then, through the cracks in the door, I heard it, a voice soft and familiar, the one voice I had longed to hear through all of this. "Mia!" I froze. It was her, Mia. "Mia, please help me!" I cried, my voice breaking. The door groaned, and slowly it began to open, and I stepped into the light. I stumbled out of the door, gasping for air, the weight of the darkness pressing down on my chest lifting slightly. For a moment, I stood there, blinking in the sudden brightness. The world outside was different, quiet, calm, almost surreal. I was back in the yard, the front porch of my house, just a few steps away. But something wasn't right. The air still felt thick with a heaviness that refused to lift, and the silence was wrong. The normal sounds of the neighborhood were absent. There were no birds chirping, no children playing, no rustling of leaves in the wind. It was as if the entire world had been swallowed by a deep, suffocating quiet. "Mia?" I called again, my voice shaky. I turned, searching for her, but the porch was empty. There was no sign of anyone. Was it real? Had I truly just escaped the nightmare, or was it some twisted illusion that I had walked into? My heart raced in my chest, the terror still lingering. I could still feel the presence behind me, the invisible weight of those two figures, their eyes watching me from the shadows. "Mia!" I shouted, desperation creeping into my voice. I ran through the yard, across the grass, and up to the door, banging on it. "Mia, please!" The door swung open on its own, creaking loudly. Inside, everything was exactly as it had been before I left. The house was the same, but it felt wrong. The air was thick with a heaviness, as if something was watching me from the corners of every room. "Mia!" I cried again, stepping inside. There was no answer. I looked through the house, frantically searching every room. The kitchen, the living room, the hallway, the stairs leading up to the second floor, all empty. I was alone. But then, as I reached the bottom of the stairs, something caught my eye, a shadow in the corner of the hallway. It was subtle at first, like the flicker of a candle's flame in the corner of my vision. But when I turned, there was nothing there. I shook my head, trying to clear the dizziness from my mind. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe I had just escaped, and the fear was still lingering in my head. But the whispers returned. "Join us. You belong to us." I froze. The whispers came from all directions, an oppressive, maddening hum that swirled around me, wrapping itself around my skull, pressing in on me. I clutched my head, trying to block them out, but it was no use. They were louder now, closer, like 1,000 voices all calling my name, begging me to join them, to accept what I had become. "No!" I shouted, backing away down the hallway, my feet unsteady beneath me. And that's when I saw her. Mia. She stood at the end of the hallway, her back to me. She was facing the mirror at the end of the hall, her expression blank, her arms hanging limply at her sides. The light from the window behind her made her look almost ethereal, but there was something wrong. Her body was stiff, unnatural, like a doll propped up in place. "Mia," I called, my voice cracking with relief. She didn't respond. I rushed toward her, my heart thudding in my chest. "Mia, please don't be like them. Don't let them take you too." But as I reached her, I saw her face. Her eyes were hollow, black as the void, her skin pale and waxy like something long dead. Her mouth hung open, as if she were about to speak, but no sound came from her. She was still, frozen in place. I staggered back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. "Mia," I whispered, barely able to form the words. "What happened to you?" She didn't answer. The whispers were growing louder, drowning out all other sounds. I could feel them in my mind now, clawing at my thoughts, pushing me toward the mirror, urging me to join her, to step into the dark, to accept what I had become. "No!" I screamed, spinning around, trying to break free of the pull. But the door slammed shut behind me, trapping me in the hallway with her. The shadows in the corners of the house seemed to shift, as if they were alive, creeping toward me. The walls themselves felt like they were closing in, constricting around me. And then I heard a voice. It was soft at first, barely a whisper, but I could hear it clearly now, cutting through the haze of panic in my mind. "Join us. Mia," I cried, my voice breaking. "Please." She didn't move, didn't even blink. I stepped closer to her, reaching out to touch her shoulder, but as my fingers brushed against her skin, a shock of cold ran through me. The contact sent a jolt of terror through my entire body, and I pulled my hand back, gasping for air. And that's when I saw it. The shadow that had been creeping along the wall was moving toward me. Slowly, deliberately. It took the shape of something humanoid, but twisted, unnatural, like a figure made of darkness itself. Its eyes gleamed with an unnatural light, and its smile was stretched far too wide, too grotesque. It stepped forward, its presence overwhelming, filling the hallway with an oppressive force. I turned to run, but the hallway had changed. The walls were no longer just stone and wood. They were alive, pulsing, breathing. The floor beneath my feet seemed to warp and shift, the house itself becoming a living thing, swallowing me whole. I could hear the figure moving behind me, its footsteps growing louder and louder as I ran, the whispers mingling with its laughter. "Join us." I slammed into the wall, my head spinning as I tried to orient myself. The air was thick, suffocating. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The house was closing in on me, trapping me, suffocating me. And then I heard a voice, a new voice, one I hadn't heard before. "It's too late, Mia." I turned, gasping. There, standing in the doorway to the living room, was my reflection, myself, staring back at me with hollow eyes. But it wasn't me. The smile on the reflection's face was twisted, malevolent. It was the thing in the shadows. And as the darkness swallowed me whole, I understood. It had always been me. The room around me began to distort, the walls warping and bending, stretching out like rubber. The air grew thick with something acrid, like the smell of decay. My legs buckled beneath me, and I collapsed to the floor, gasping for air that seemed to slip through my lungs, leaving me weak and cold. The figure in the reflection, the thing that was me but not me, stepped forward, its twisted smile widening, exposing rows of sharp, glistening teeth. It was getting closer, and I couldn't move. My limbs felt like stone, too heavy to lift. "Join us." The voice echoed through the house, each word a jagged shard of terror, digging into my mind. The creature that had once been my reflection knelt down beside me, its eyes gleaming like black holes, empty and consuming. It reached out a hand, and I could feel the coldness of it even from where I lay. I couldn't bring myself to scream. The fear was too much. It had drained me, leaving me hollow and powerless. "You've always been here," it said, its voice like gravel scraping against stone, rough and hollow. "You just didn't know it." I tried to speak, but no words came. My throat was tight, constricted, as though the house itself was squeezing the life from me. Every time you felt alone, every time you heard the whispers, it was me. It was always me. You belonged to me from the start. I wanted to cry, to scream, to fight, but all I could do was stare into the abyss of its eyes. And slowly, the truth began to seep into my mind like poison. This house, this place, wasn't just a building. It was a prison, and I was a part of it. It had been waiting for me, watching. The whispers had been its calling card, drawing me in slowly, bit by bit. Each moment of loneliness, each flicker of doubt, each shadow in the corner of my vision. It had been the house, guiding me, waiting for me to come to it, to accept it, to join it. And now I was part of it. I was nothing but a fragment of its existence. I could feel the darkness closing in around me, smothering me, as though the house was swallowing me whole, claiming me as its own. The reflection in front of me smiled wider, and I realized that it wasn't just a reflection. It was me, but the version of me that had accepted the house's invitation long ago, the one that had given in. "Join us." The darkness around me deepened, and my body went numb. I was drowning in it, suffocating under its weight. There was no escape. There was no way out. I had been taken. The house had claimed me. And just like every other soul before me, I had become another piece of it, lost and forgotten, trapped forever in its endless, shifting halls. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me completely was the figure of Mia. No longer just a memory, but a part of the house too. Her hollow eyes stared at me from the shadows, a smile curling on her lips as she beckoned me to join her. And then everything went black. The morning sun shone brightly through the windows of the house as the new tenants moved in. It was a quiet, peaceful morning, the birds chirping in the distance. But as they stepped onto the front porch, something felt wrong. They looked around, and though the house seemed perfectly ordinary, there was something in the air, something heavy, oppressive, something waiting. And from the window of the living room, just for a moment, they thought they saw a figure standing in the dark hallway. A smile wide and twisted, but when they blinked, it was gone. As the new tenants unpacked their things, the house seemed to settle around them, its creaks and groans carrying the weight of its many years. The sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floors. It felt like any other house, quiet, familiar, nothing out of the ordinary. But there was a lingering unease, a tension that no one could quite place. As they moved from room to room, they noticed something odd. The hallways, though well lit, seemed darker than they should be. The air felt thick, like something was pressing down on them. Every so often, a flicker of movement would catch the corner of their vision, but when they turned, nothing was there. In the living room, one of them stopped and stared at the wall, the silence enveloping them. They couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. They looked over their shoulder, but the room was empty. The house was silent, save for the soft rustling of leaves outside. "Did you hear that?" the woman asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man looked up, confused. "What?" She stared at the window, her eyes widening. Something's watching us." He frowned and went to the window, glancing out into the yard. There was nothing unusual, just the neighbor's house next door, empty and quiet. But when he turned back, he saw it. A shadow, a flicker of something standing just beyond the threshold of the hallway. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The woman noticed it too. "What is that?" They both stood there, their eyes locked on the shadowy figure. The figure didn't move, but they both felt its presence, as if it were staring back at them. "Maybe it's just the lighting," the man said, his voice shaky, trying to convince himself it was nothing. A trick of the shadows. But the air was thick, and the whispering started again. "Join us." The voice was faint at first, like a breath on the wind, but as they listened, it grew louder, pressing into their minds, urging them toward the darkness. The house felt alive with it. The woman stepped forward, her feet dragging as if something invisible was pulling her toward the hallway. The man reached for her, trying to stop her, but she slipped through his fingers. She didn't seem to hear him anymore, her eyes glazed over, fixated on the shadow at the end of the hall. He grabbed her arm, yanking her back. "Don't! You can't!" But it was too late. She was already gone. He stood frozen, unable to move, his heart hammering in his chest as the shadow in the hallway grew larger, darker, stretching toward him like something alive. The whispers intensified, filling his head, his thoughts. "Join us." And then he heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind him, soft and steady, like someone walking just out of sight. With a jolt, he turned around, his pulse racing. But there was nothing there, just the hallway, stretching endlessly before him. The walls seemed to close in, suffocating him with their weight. And then in the corner of his eye, he saw her again, his wife, standing at the top of the stairs, her eyes hollow and empty, her mouth twisted into a grin. She wasn't herself anymore. He reached out, but his hand passed through her. She wasn't really there. She was just a shadow. And as the whispers filled his ears, as the darkness closed in, he understood. The house was never empty. It had never been silent. The new tenants were just the next ones to hear the call. The next ones to be drawn into the web of the house. The next ones to join them. In the end, the house was always hungry. It would always wait for the next soul to wander too close. Always watching, always listening. And when the time came, when the whispers grew loud enough, it would call. And someone would listen. And then, they too would become part of its endless, living nightmare. And that's the end of tonight's stories. Keep listening to the sound of rain and fall into a deep, peaceful sleep.